The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit. Psalms 34:18. Chapter 1. August 1868, Walton Valley, Kansas. "What do you think you're doing?" Hannah Fairchild demanded. Luke Johnson swept his hat from his head and put down the mallet he was using to hammer a stake into the Kansas prairie. "Staking my claim." It was a silly question. She could see for herself what he was doing. The question was, why? Or more precisely, why there, on the land next to her home? Here? He met her hostile glare unflinchingly. "Yes, ma'am." Hannah swept a hand in front of her, encompassing the land as far as she could see in every direction. "There's available land all over the West." He raised an eyebrow at her tone, then smiled. "I like Walton Valley." She swallowed down the childish retort that sat on the tip of her tongue, begging to be spoken out loud. "Walton Valley doesn't like you." Of course, that was a complete lie. Everyone in the tiny settlement loved the traveling preacher. Staking a land claim seemed contrary to Luke's self-professed vocation. Hannah tried again. "How can you farm your land if you're always away preaching God's word?" "I want a home of my own," Luke responded evenly. "I don't know if I'll farm yet. As you say, I travel frequently." He still hadn't actually answered the question she'd asked in 3 different ways. Hannah racked her brain to find a different way to ask it, one that might lead him to be honest about why he was moving in next door. The strange feeling she'd been experiencing over the last few days came over her, and she gasped. Hannah rested a hand on her growing belly. It wasn't a painful sensation, just unusual. She had spoken to George about it, and the other woman had patted her hand and assured her it was quite normal. The fluttering was her baby moving inside her. Luke stepped forward. "Miss Fairchild, are you all right?" Hannah stared at him, anger at her situation boiling over. "I'm having a baby. Of course I'm not all right." The preacher's cheeks reddened. I'm sorry." She immediately felt contrite. It wasn't his fault she was angry at what had happened to her, and he had done nothing wrong. He was simply showing her concern. "There are no prayers you can share that will make this go away." "You wish your child away?" he asked, shock replacing embarrassment on his handsome face. Hannah lifted a shoulder. "I love my baby." "But not the conception or the predicament it has placed you in," he said in quiet understanding. She lifted her chin. "No one has yet sought to judge me." "And no one should," Luke agreed. "What happened to you was an abomination." Hannah blinked at the vehemence in his tone. There had been a time when she first arrived at Walton Valley and met the preacher, that she was aware of a certain light in his eyes when he looked her way. She wasn't so innocent, even before her uncle assaulted her, that she did not know what that meant. Back then he had been sweet on her. Now he knew the truth. She was the object of his pity. Her stomach told its own story of the sin committed against her. Whether it was her fault did not matter. She was the one who would bear the shame. It meant that good men, ones like Luke, would not give her a second glance. Frustration at the injustice did not stop Hannah from directing her resentment at him. "Yet I am the one who will pay for the rest of my life." He shook his head. "It doesn't have to be that way." "Yes, it does." Hannah looked away. "Whether more people come to settle here in Walton Valley, or I meet someone elsewhere, I will either have to lie about my past or tell the truth, and risk both myself and my child being rejected. No one should judge you harshly." "You've already said that," she said hotly. "We both know how people are. They will question my morals, and my child will be treated differently because of the circumstances around its birth." "It's so unfair." Luke twirled his hat in his hands. "The Bible doesn't teach such harsh judgments, especially toward innocents." "Yes, your Jesus loved everyone, didn't he?" she asked, her voice low and mocking. "Even my uncle." Luke opened his mouth as though to answer and then closed it again. "The Bible is clear on God's stance on criminals. In Romans we are told, 'Avenge not yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. For it is written, Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord.'" Hannah tilted her head to one side. I can't take revenge on my uncle, even if I wanted to. He is in prison. For another offense, Luke said, even if he never receives just punishment in this life, God will see that he is judged for his sins in the next. And therein lay her problem. She didn't want her Uncle Philip to wait until his death to receive a penalty for his actions. She wanted him to suffer for his crime now. That made her a poor Christian, and nothing Luke said to her would make her believe differently. The book of Matthew encouraged a person to turn the other cheek, but that wasn't something she could do. Not when the pit of her stomach burned with the injustice of her uncle's actions. At first it had devastated her beyond words, but that was compounded when she realized she was to bear a child. As her misery had faded, it was replaced with a white-hot fury that she could not extinguish. I don't know that I believe in a God who allows such wickedness in his world, Hannah said, the words tumbling out of her mouth. I can understand why you would think that way. Luke gazed at her, and Hannah tried not to notice how his dark eyelashes curled upwards and framed his blue eyes. All I can tell you is that he gave every person the ability to choose his or her actions. God will not control an individual's behavior. It was an argument her sister Eliza had used several times. It didn't change how she felt. He wasn't there when I needed him. Hannah, do you think God let you down? I know he let me down, she retorted. He should have done something to stop Uncle Philip. I don't believe he could do anything to stop what happened, Luke said softly, looking at the ruts cut into the earth by countless wagon wheels, as if they held the answers to every question in the universe. But he sent your sister and Thomas to help you. Hannah could sense his discomfort, but to his credit, he wasn't avoiding the incredibly difficult subject. His sympathy didn't change a thing. She was still ruined for all decent men. Glad you took my advice, Noah called as he approached them. Luke glanced at Hannah. Her initial anger at seeing him driving stakes into the ground, marking out the borders of his land, had abated. He wished he could be more eloquent and help her see that blaming God for the terrible event that had shaped her life wasn't the answer. He knew that because he had done the same thing himself. When his own life had imploded and an outlaw shot his best friend dead, the only person Luke hated more than God was himself. When I heard Thomas would be away for a couple of months, I felt as though God was calling me to Walton Valley. I will farm his land while he's away, and in return, he said he will help me plow and plant my crops in the spring, should I choose to farm. I suppose Eliza was aware of your plans? Hannah asked sharply. You will need to speak to your sister about that, Luke said, though he already knew the answer. He wished he knew what it was about him that Hannah disliked so much. She didn't look at Noah with such open hostility. In fact, she seemed very fond of the Prescott brothers, but particularly Noah. There had been a time when he first met Hannah that he had entertained thoughts of courting her. The knowledge she was to have a child following her uncle's abominable behavior was not the reason he had shelved his romantic contemplations. Hannah's attitude towards him made it appear she could see right into his soul, and she'd found it severely lacking. Luke struggled enough with the shame of his past without spending any more time than was necessary with someone who had already judged him lacking. Wanting to restore Hannah's faith in the Lord was his vocation. Why would you buy land and not farm it? Hannah wondered. It makes no sense. I want a home of my own, Luke said, trying to keep his voice even. Farming had been Silas's dream, not his. When he learned Thomas was to travel back to Independence for the trial of Eliza and Hannah's uncle, Luke had felt a sharp nudge to not only help Thomas, but honor his old friend. Silas had been a good man. Luke had not. Hannah looked pointedly into the distance. Like I said earlier, there are acres of free land. Noah's eyebrows rose in surprise at Hannah's tone. He slapped Luke on the back. Well, I'm glad you're here. Heat bloomed in Hannah's cheeks at Noah's gentle rebuke, but she did not apologize for her rudeness. Who will care for your flock while you're here playing at pioneer and farmer? Council Grove has several preachers. One of the others will continue the traveling route while I decide my future. How fortunate for you to have choices and opportunities. There was no disguising the bitterness in Hannah's voice, and she didn't even try. How does a preacher afford to stake a claim anyhow? Luke blinked at her ability to make preacher sound like a curse word. He wished he could tell her the truth about where his money had come from, but he couldn't. She already hated him enough. I intend to be a good neighbor and help this community prosper, he said instead. Hannah shook her head and stalked back toward the cabin she shared with her sister Eliza and her husband Thomas. She's not usually like that, Noah apologized. Usually she's very pleasant. Perhaps the heat is making her uncomfortable, Luke suggested. She acted a little oddly earlier. That was probably the baby moving. Noah kicked at the dirt. Eli told her it was normal at this stage of her, condition. How are you so knowledgeable? Luke asked, wishing the question was completely innocent and not because he felt jealous the younger man knew so much. Though why he should care about Noah's closeness to Hannah when she seemed to detest him, he couldn't fathom. Everyone here talks about things quite openly at dinner. Noah shrugged. It doesn't bother me, except talking about Hannah's baby reminds me of what happened to her. Hopefully, Hannah's uncle will receive a just punishment at his trial later this month. That won't change the situation, though, will it? Dust flew up as Noah took out his frustration on the earth. No, it won't, Luke agreed. I wish I had a better solution for Hannah. His words about God judging Hannah's uncle for his crimes were weak. She didn't care about any reckoning Philip Fairchild may face in the afterlife. It was as useless to her as the one her uncle would face during his trial for embezzling money from the trust fund left for Hannah and her sister by their parents. Neither outcome would change the way her life had been irrevocably altered because of Philip's actions. Did you know the preacher was staking his claim for the land next to ours? Hannah demanded, as she strode back into the small cabin she shared with her sister Eliza and her husband Thomas. Eliza raised an eyebrow. Thomas mentioned Luke liked the community here and would carry out his work while we are away for Uncle Philip's trial. Why wouldn't you tell me that? Hannah was aware she sounded like a petulant child, but couldn't seem to help the frustration bubbling up inside her. Eliza put her sewing project on her lap. If I had known you would be cross, I would have said something straight away. I know Luke isn't your favorite person, but I hadn't realized you were so against him. I'm not against him. Hannah plonked down in the chair opposite Eliza. Ah, Eliza said with a knowing smile. You're against him because he's a man of religion. It's not that, Hannah flapped a hand in front of her face, but it did little to shift the air enough to cool her down. Well, it's not just that. I think you like him. I cannot abide the man, Hannah retorted. Why? He's insufferable. What has he done that's insufferable? He has just been babbling some nonsense about how Uncle Philip will receive a reckoning before the Lord. Hannah shook her head, as if that will make a difference to me. It won't change your situation, Eliza said gently, but surely it will give you some comfort to know that he will stay in prison where he belongs. I was greatly comforted when I was first aware he had been arrested. Hannah rested her hands on top of the swell of her belly. But whatever sentence he receives for stealing our inheritance will not be enough. Is it for us to judge him? Yes, Hannah slapped a hand on the table. I think I have every right to judge him. My goodness, Eliza, you sound just like Luke. No one is better placed than you to decide his punishment, Eliza said in a carefully placating tone. But that will not happen in this world. So you think the same as Luke, and that I should content myself knowing that God will punish Philip as he sees fit? Eliza shook her head. Content is not the right word. I can't pretend to know how you feel. Neither can I suggest you should accept things you cannot change, but you need to find a way of dealing with your anger. Hannah let out a breath. Instead of taking it out on our new neighbor, you mean? Have you been doing that? She looked toward the open door of their cabin, as if Luke would appear there if she were to be untruthful to her sister. A little. I'm certain he didn't mean to upset you. Thomas will be cross with me if he thinks I've upset Luke, won't he? Especially if he has promised to do Thomas's work when you go back to Independence. She hated to think she may have done something that would affect her brother-in-law. If it wasn't for him marrying Eliza and taking both sisters away from their uncle's clutches, things could have been much worse than they were. She might not owe him her life, but she certainly owed him her sanity. Eliza smiled. Thomas understands your situation is difficult. The last few months have been particularly hard for you. Now you're stuck in a new place. The weather is uncommonly warm, and you're to have a baby. George has told me how uncomfortable that condition can be. Hannah didn't miss the wistful look her sister sent toward her stomach. She didn't mean to act so furiously, but it was impossible not to regret the loss of things she could never have because of her uncle. She must try harder not to be selfish. Eliza had done a completely selfless thing in marrying Thomas, so they could leave independence. That her hasty marriage had turned out to be a love match was a true blessing. I wish you didn't have to leave for so long. Hannah was surprised at the prick of tears behind her eyes. For months now she had known that Thomas and Eliza would leave Walton Valley at the end of the summer to travel back to Missouri for their uncle's trial. Eliza stood and put her sewing on the table. She moved to her sister's side. "You can come with us." Hannah shook her head wildly. Her hand shook as she reached out to take Eliza's. "I can never go back there." "I hate to leave you here alone." She smiled up at Eliza. "I won't be by myself. George and Grace will keep me company while the men work. And of course, little Beth. She is such a darling." Beth was George's daughter. Born the day Eliza and Hannah arrived in Walton Valley, she offered a gummy smile to everyone she saw. Everyone in their little community loved the adorable baby girl, but she particularly captivated Noah. "I think you should stay with Grace while we are away." "Yes, some distance between me and Luke is an excellent idea." Eliza bit her lip. "I meant for your safety. I would feel happier knowing you were not alone at night, particularly because the baby is growing as quickly as it is. If there were any other way to secure Philip's conviction, I would take it so I didn't have to leave you. Thomas is excited about his family arriving too. You should be there for that, at your husband's side. You have both done so much for me. I won't hear of you coming home early." "Did Eli talk to you about the baby?" Eliza asked, returning to her seat as she spoke. Hannah knew what George's husband thought. Elijah Mitchell was a qualified doctor, and although there wasn't much call for his skills while their community was so small, he had already proven himself to be an extremely competent physician. "Eli is wrong. I'm not confused about the dates." "No, we both know only too well when the incident happened." Eliza put the material on her lap and picked up her needle. There were no previous occasions. "I think I would remember." A tide of frustration rose inside Hannah. It didn't seem to matter how many times she had answered both that and other similar questions. "Eli thinks you're much further along," Eliza said. "The baby must be large." Hannah shrugged. "Eli said that feeling the baby move at this stage is normal." "What do either of us know about such things?" Eliza continued hemming the curtains she was making to sell at the general store in Council Grove. "Please listen to Eli and look after yourself while I'm away." Eliza stabbed her needle into the material and did not look up. The wobble in her voice confirmed what Hannah already knew. Her sister was upset. "I promise," Hannah breathed. "I will do whatever you ask of me." Chapter 2. Luke looked at Hannah as she helped Grace carry the evening meal from the cabin. He willed her to look his way so he could smile, anything to show her she had nothing to fear with him around. He couldn't think of any other reason for her behavior toward him. People who were afraid often seemed angry or upset. She did not glance his way. He sat on a long bench in between Noah and Josh. Grace and Hannah sat at each end. "Perhaps you would like to say grace on your first evening as a member of our little community," Eli suggested. Luke smiled at the man opposite and dragged his attention away from trying to think of something to say to Hannah to engage her in conversation. "I appreciate your suggestion, thank you." "It'll be real nice having a preacher here every day," Harry commented. "Daddy, you've never attended church in your life. Why are you so excited Luke is here?" George asked with an indulgent smile in her father's direction. "Been thinking on getting baptized." He nodded at the baby in the crib resting on the hard-packed dirt next to their table. "Ain't done her no harm." "It would honor me to baptize you, sir." "Ain't no need for formalities out here, son. I'm Harry. Not sir or Mr. Walton, just plain old Harry." "Then I insist you all call me by my given name and not preacher," Luke said. Maybe if Hannah saw him as just another member of their community, She would be more inclined to listen to him and not walk off every time she saw him approaching, as she had that day. Harry shook his head. Now that ain't right. It's like the doc here. The old man indicated his son-in-law, Eli. I can't call him anything other than Doc, because that's what he is. It's a matter of respect. That's different. Eli spent years learning how to become a doctor. Luke stopped talking. No one needed to know how he came to travel from one frontier town to another, preaching the Lord's word. Don't stop there, Hannah's voice sounded in the evening air. Tell us how you became a preacher. I'd love to hear that story. Oh yes, Noah added with his usual enthusiasm. I'd like to hear that story too. Luke helped himself to a serving of rabbit stew, allowing himself time to think. Telling the truth was not an option, but he could think of a way of letting his new friends know what they wanted without telling a lie. For the first 22 years of his life, he hadn't always lived in a way that would make God proud. Since then, he had done whatever he thought would have made Silas proud. I haven't always been a godly man, Luke began. In fact, as recently as a few years back, I'd completely stopped attending church services. I moved around a lot. Is that why it has been important for you to preach to communities who don't have their own church? Josh asked. He considered the question as he chewed a mouthful of stew. Partly, but honestly, it wasn't because there wasn't a church nearby that I wasn't attending services. It was because I thought I could get along without God. I believed I didn't need him. Goodness, Grace said. How did a man such as yourself arrive at such a conclusion? Grace, Eli's mother, was a refined lady who had traveled west with her son and settled in Walton Valley following Harry's accident. Eli had refused to continue on the journey to Santa Fe, but had remained with Harry to ensure he had a full recovery. Luke didn't know her story, but it was obvious after even a few minutes in her presence that she was much more accustomed to taking afternoon tea in the parlor of a fine house than cooking stew in a cramped cabin on the Kansas prairie. My best friend died, Luke spoke, past the lump that formed in his throat every time he thought of Silas. He died because of my selfishness, and because I cared more about money than his safety. That made you turn back to God, Hannah asked, disbelief sounding loudly in her softly spoken words. It made me question the way I had been living my life, Luke said carefully. I quickly concluded that my life was better with God in it than not. Was your friend a God-fearing fella? Harry asked. Silas was whatever I was. Luke forced himself not to close his eyes and look away from the well-meaning looks of concern from the little group of settlers. The truth was Silas took his cues from Luke. If he hadn't chosen to be in that frontier town that night, Silas wouldn't have been there either. Yes, he was. Luke pushed his plate away, no longer hungry, even when I wasn't. I'm mighty sorry for your loss, preacher. I'm sorry we made you talk about something that causes you pain. Noah laid a hand on Luke's arm. It was a privilege to count Silas as a friend. Luke took a sip of water. I am blessed every day to have had such a good man in my life. I try to live every day now in a way that honors his life. Back to my question. Harry finished his meal and looked at Grace before placing his cutlery neatly on the edge of his plate. What's next? Luke frowned, trying to remember what they had been discussing before the subject of Silas had arisen. Eventually, he recalled the older man asking if Luke would baptize him. Next, we talk about your decision. You make sure it's something you're ready to do. As I'm sure you know, you're choosing to commit your life to the Lord. It's customary for parents to choose godparents for their children. Perhaps you'd like to think of a few people who will help you in your walk with the Lord. Yep. Harry's weathered face crinkled as he grinned widely, showing off many spaces where there should have been teeth. I can already think of a few, but I reckon I should ask them privately, right? I look forward to hearing your thoughts. To Luke's immense relief, no one asked any more questions about Silas or how he had died, and the conversation moved along to Harry's store and the items he intended to stock. Hannah, my girl, Harry limped along behind her as she walked down to the river at the back of Grace's property. I hope you will not insist on carrying the bucket back up to the cabin again, she asked with a smile on her lips. Harry often overestimated what he could do following his leg injury. His accident affected his balance, but he was loath to accept that was permanent. Didn't end so good last time, did it? Disastrously, Hannah grinned. Harry had caught his foot on a tree root and ended up sprawled in the dirt with a split lip for his trouble. Yeah, well, Harry said. Thought I was being all gentlemanly. You were, Hannah agreed. And you know how much I appreciate your help. But not when there's a bucket of water needs carrying. Harry spread his arms out wide. I learned my lesson. Now we've established that's not why you're following me to the river. What can I do for you? Well, it's like this. Harry looked away from Hannah and down at the ground. I'm gonna need some help with the baptism thing. I want to do it. I ain't never been a good example for George, but I want to do better for her little 'un. That's very sweet, Harry. Hannah thought about her own father, who had always been an excellent example to both herself and Eliza, but was no longer alive to influence her own child when it came. But you must know I struggle to believe completely in God's plan. Harry gestured towards Hannah's belly. Because of what happened to you. Yes, she whispered, feeling the same guilt she did every single time anyone brought any attention to her child. Seems to me it was the fellow who done the deed who is to blame, not God. Harry looked directly at her. And certainly not you, so take that look off of your face. What do you mean? The one you have right now, Harry said. You are, and always will be, a very lovely and upstanding English lady. Ain't nothing gonna change that. Tears pricked Hannah's eyes. They weren't anything new. Sometimes it seemed as though she had been crying, or at least on the verge of weeping for months now. First she had lost her parents to cholera. Then she and Eliza had been taken into the care of their father's brother and his wife. Their life with Uncle Philip and Aunt Helen had been unpleasant, with their guardians caring more about the money in their trust fund than the girls themselves. When Eliza had realized their uncle had brutally attacked Hannah, she had immediately made plans to get them away from Independence, Missouri, and to safety. Oh, Harry, Hannah whispered. If only that were true. I'm ruined. You must see that? Nope, Harry replied. I do not. And there ain't no one here who thinks that either. Hannah shrugged. But everywhere else? If one day I wanted to find a husband, where would I find one who could see past the stain on my character? Harry reached out and wiped the tears from her face. Hannah, if a man can't see past something that was out of your control, then he ain't worth having. Hannah allowed the old man to fold her into an awkward embrace. He patted her back a few times while taking care not to touch her stomach. Thank you, Harry. Now. He rubbed his hands briskly, clearly hoping the emotional part of their conversation was over. About you helping me with the God stuff, will ya? I'd be glad to help you if I can. Seems like maybe we could help each other? In what way? Hannah allowed skepticism to sound in her voice. She'd be glad to help Harry, but, as she had already alluded to, her own relationship with God was on shaky ground. Maybe if I'm struggling one day, you can say a prayer for me. Then if you're having a bad day, I can say one for you. You strike a hard bargain, Hannah grinned. But that seems very fair to me. Grace is wondering if you've got lost fetching the water, Luke called, shading his eyes from the setting sun. Harry nodded his head in Luke's direction. Don't seem like he sees any stains on your character. Hannah raised an eyebrow. I do hope you're not thinking of doing any matchmaking, because I can tell you now, that will not work. What? Harry said with a mock innocent expression. Just saying he's a nice fella is all. Luke had covered the ground between them with his long, easy stride before Hannah could form a response. He reached over and took the bucket from Hannah's hand. Please let me carry the water for you, Miss Fairchild. There's no water in the bucket, Hannah replied, caustically. Luke flushed. Of course not. I meant I would be glad to fill the bucket and then carry it for you. Remember what I said, Harry said with a chuckle. No stains there. No stains, Luke's forehead puckered. Whatever does he mean? There's no telling with Harry, Hannah said quickly. No point us both walking down to the creek. Thank you for taking over that chore for me. You could still walk with me? Hannah heard the pleading note in Luke's voice, but ignored it. When she had first met him, he had looked at her with obvious admiration in his gaze. That light had gone out when he realized her circumstances. She would not spend any more time than was necessary with a man who felt only pity for her. One day she was certain she would meet a man who looked at her the same way Eliza's husband looked at her. That was the man she would marry, and she refused to settle for anything less because of the actions of her cruel uncle. The sun had barely peeped over the horizon as Luke walked down to the creek to wash. He followed the flow of the water away from the settlement far enough that if someone else awoke early, they would not encounter him. He sat on the bank with his battered Bible on his lap as he prayed for God's guiding hand to help him through the day. He'd baptized people before, but never someone who meant something to him. The others were faceless people in towns, the names of which he had long since forgotten. Harry Walton was a friend, a neighbor, and a man whose shrewd gaze bore into Luke as though he could see right through to the shame of his past. Luke didn't doubt that Harry would be the type of new Christian who asked troublesome questions and wouldn't rest until he had tested his preacher's knowledge thoroughly. For the 100th time since Silas's death, Luke asked himself if he was up to the task. One of his main reasons for settling in Walton Valley was to bring Hannah back to the Lord. Her deep sadness pulled at his heartstrings and reminded him all too clearly of the event that changed his own life. While Hannah hadn't done a single thing to bring about the incident that had shattered her future, the same couldn't be said for him. He prayed for direction in delivering the right words to say to both Harry and Hannah. Luke opened his eyes and looked back to the stakes in the ground that marked out the part of the wild Kansas prairie that belonged to him. Settling down was another of those things contained on his list to redemption, the things he had to do before he could even begin to forgive himself. Shuffling in the dirt behind him alerted Luke to another person up and about. He turned to see Harry approaching, the man's awkward gait kicking up dust as he approached. "Can't sneak up on a person these days," Harry said ruefully. "Could sneak up on prairie hares and catch them with my bare hands once." Luke rose an eyebrow. "That right?" "Yep." Harry scratched his head. "Gotta leave all the hunting up to young Noah now. If and I try, the prairie empties of wildlife before I've moved off my own land." "Noah seems very successful at catching meat for the settlement," Luke said, recalling the dinner Grace had prepared the previous evening. Not that he had done the meal justice, but it was very good. "I've taught him a lot." Harry bent his good leg and slowly lowered himself onto the ground beside Luke. "He's a good boy." "I like everyone here in Walton Valley," Luke said carefully, feeling as though the other man was giving him some sort of test. "Yep, it's a settled community." "Are you worried I will unsettle it?" "Glad you're the plain-talkin' type," Harry said approvingly. "Why don't you say what's on your mind? I'm confident we can get it cleared up before the ladies even start breakfast. Hannah seems mighty upset at you being here." And Luke prodded. Something flashed in Harry's eyes. "Should you do anything to cause that little lady more distress, I will not be held responsible for my actions." "Are you threatening me?" Luke said in disbelief. "In front of God, and on a Sunday too." Harry folded his hands primly in his lap. "I'm not threatening you, Sonny. I'm letting you know how it is. I suppose if I did something you didn't like, I would have an unfortunate accident." "Those are your words." Harry's mouth twitched. "But I think we've reached an understanding, haven't we?" "I wouldn't do anything to hurt Hannah. She's a very sweet girl." Harry raised a finger and jabbed it into Luke's arm. "You like her." "Of course I like her. As I said." "Naw." Harry poked harder. "You have feelings for her like a man has for a woman." Luke sighed. "It doesn't matter if I have. She hates me, and I don't deserve a lady like that for my wife." Harry let out a low whistle. "Them's some big feelin's." There was no point in backtracking now. He'd already dipped one toe in the water. He might as well jump right in. "Happened the very first time I saw her, and it's kind of grown from there." "What you gonna do about it?" "I don't know." Luke rubbed a hand over his face. He'd come out here to pray and be alone with his thoughts. Now he was stuck in a conversation with Harry and could see no way out. The only person she seems to dislike more than me is God. She's angry. Harry picked up the Bible and started flipping through the pages. Is there anything in here that will help? At last, something he thought he could talk about that wasn't too personal. Yes, there are many verses that will bring Hannah comfort. You think that's what she needs? Luke ran a finger along the back of his collar. It wasn't just the heat of the morning sun making him feel hot and bothered. Harry had a way of probing him that left Luke doubting his calling even more. I think so. Maybe that's what you think she needs. Do you think I'm wrong? Has offering her comfort worked for you so far? Well, no. Harry grinned his gap-toothed smile. So you gotta think of another way to get through to her. Do you have a suggestion that you think might help? So glad you eventually asked, Harry guffawed. Ain't nothing you can do to make that poor child feel better about what happened. We can't go back and change what's already done. Okay. What she needs is to be treated the same as every other girl her age. Harry eyed Luke slyly. That's why she is such good friends with Noah. Noah? Luke hated that the other man's name tasted bitter on his tongue. Noah treats Hannah like the little sister he's never had. He doesn't treat her like she's damaged goods. She's not. Luke started hotly. Of course she isn't. Harry patted Luke's thigh. But she thinks she is. The best way for her to accept that she isn't is for you to treat her normally. But she hates you, Harry said. But is that because every time you talk to her, you preach? Luke spread his hands out in defeat. Harry, I'm a preacher. Not when you've got powerful feelings for the girl. You're not. I don't understand. If and you want her to fall in love with you, you treat her like a man treats a woman. You don't talk to her about God. But I'm a preacher, Luke repeated. You wantin' my help or not? Luke wasn't sure he'd asked for Harry's help, but it seemed a little late in the conversation to point that out. He was getting Harry's advice whether or not he wanted it. Carry on. She has to see you as a man first, preacher second. Finally, Luke thought he understood what Harry was driving at. If she falls in love with me the man, she will find it easier to fall in love with me the preacher? I think ye have it, Harry nodded approvingly. Only I'm not nearly good enough for her. Harry gazed at Luke, and a look of disappointment filled his face. Of course you're not. You need to work on that dark side of yourself, Sonny. Luke looked down at the ground, too ashamed of his past to meet Harry's eyes. I'm trying. That's all anyone can ask. Harry got to his feet and patted Luke's shoulder. I guess I'll be leaving you now because I think you've got a whole lot of other prayers to say, haven't you? There wasn't a chance Harry knew what had happened in Luke's past, but he clearly had a good idea that Luke hadn't always been the responsible man that he was now. A man who put God before everything and anyone else. Someone that Silas would have been happy to call his friend. He wasn't the same person he'd been when he ignored Silas's pleas to leave that last frontier town before things went bad. Luke hadn't listened that afternoon, and he would regret that for the rest of his life because it was the last conversation he had with his friend. Chapter 3. Do you have everything you need for your house? Eli asked Luke that evening. You will let us know if there's something we can do to help? Noah laughed and jerked a thumb in Luke's direction. The preacher thinks he can hold his house together with one of his prayers. What do you mean? Eli asked. Luke didn't buy nails from Council Grove when he was passing through on his way here from Topeka. Hannah joined in the merriment that quickly swept through their community. Even she knew building a house required nails. Surely we have nails we can give to Luke, Grace wondered when the chuckles died down. Use the last ones to repair the chicken coop, Josh said with a grimace. We've been so busy harvesting. We haven't replenished our building supplies. He would not last 2 minutes out here on the prairie if he couldn't even remember the obvious things he would need. Hannah hoped he would realize that this life wasn't for him, and he would move on again. Perhaps we need to make a list of everything our community needs. Grace blew a raspberry at Baby Beth, who flashed her a gummy grin in response. Hannah's belly contracted. Despite her growing girth, it still seemed inconceivable to her she would have a baby of her own in 4 short months. Would she know how to care for it? Or would she be like Luke with his house and not even know the basic facts? If we do that this evening, I'll set off early in the morning to Council Grove, Luke said eagerly, clearly hoping to move the conversation on from his basic error. Eliza, did you have some things you were hoping to sell at the store? Thomas asked as he turned to his wife. Hannah looked away. Sometimes the affection she saw between Eliza and her husband only reminded her of what she wanted and did not have. The pain of her dashed dreams was the hardest to take. How would she ever find someone to love her after what had happened? I have curtains and dresses I'd like to sell. Thought we were saving this stuff for our own store? Harry asked morosely. You think we are ever going to get time to build it? Sure we are. Noah pulled the serving bowl toward him. Say, can I have seconds? Josh elbowed his brother. You've already had seconds, Noah Prescott. There's more inside, Grace said in her usual calm way. You don't think I've been cooking for you boys all this time without learning not to put the entire meal on the table at once? I'll fetch it, Luke offered, and got up from his seat. Hannah felt his eyes on her as he walked the short distance to Grace's cabin. His boots sounded heavy on the wood floor as he entered the small home. She hated she was always so aware of where he was and what he was doing. He was so infuriating with his belief that God could cure everything. Hannah knew differently. In a few short weeks the harvest will be in, and we can all work on Luke's house and the store. Josh accepted the bowl from his brother and added more food to his own tin plate. If we get all the supplies we need from Council Grove now, we can build both structures before the weather turns bad. Harry nodded. That seems fair. You gonna make more fripperies for my store, Eliza? I need different fabric, Eliza said. I'm hoping to sew some dresses that will be more suited to cold weather. Ideally, I'd like to take some samples to Council Grove when Thomas and I leave in a couple of weeks. Perhaps you should go with Luke. He won't know which things to choose. That's right, he won't. Eliza leaned forward and leaned her elbows on the table, separating her from Hannah. But you would. No, Hannah replied sharply. I'm not going anywhere with that man. The easy camaraderie around the table ceased as Luke paused in the doorway of Grace's home with the large cooking pot in his covered hands. His cheeks were flushed, and Hannah looked away, hoping it was because of the heat over the fire in Grace's cabin, but certain he had overheard her harsh words. I'm working with the men in the fields until the harvest is in, Eliza said in a low voice. It has to be you that goes. She could refuse. She should refuse. There were so many reasons she didn't want to make the trip, especially with Luke. You know I would do anything for you, Eliza, but it wouldn't be proper, would it? S'pose I'd best come with you, Harry cackled. Wouldn't do for the good folk of Council Grove to think we live like heathens out here. That does rather take care of propriety. Eliza looked at Hannah with an obvious challenge in her eyes. Is that acceptable? Her gaze flicked to Luke as he put the rest of the food in the middle of the table. He was embarrassed. And it was her fault. Yes, of course. Thank you, Harry. I apologize for being so rude. Please forgive me, Luke. I'm rather fearful of leaving Walton Valley. You don't need to worry about your safety with two strapping fellas to protect you. Harry pushed out his scrawny chest. Everyone laughed, and normal chatter around the table resumed. If only Luke had remembered to get all the supplies he would need after he'd staked his claim in Topeka. Then there would be no immediate need for the trip to Council Grove. She could stay in Walton Valley where she was sheltered and did not have to endure meaningful glances from strangers between her stomach and her wedding finger. She wished he was more organized, but the truth of the matter was she would do anything Eliza asked of her. Hannah owed her sister and Thomas. Their marriage had allowed her to escape her abusive uncle and find shelter in the little community she had come to love so much. Delivering Eliza's handiwork and picking out new material was the very least she could do for her sister, who had sacrificed her own happiness for Hannah. Luckily, of course, it had all worked out for the best for Eliza and Thomas. It was clear to anyone that they adored one another, and their marriage had grown from one of desperation to incredible happiness. And to her endless shame, it was something that Hannah was dreadfully jealous of. If she believed he would answer her prayers, she'd ask for God's help to be more selfless, like Eliza, more accepting of her situation, she was certain there were other people who were in far worse circumstances than her. She wished she disliked Luke. That would make things easier, but she didn't. If things had been different, she would have welcomed his courtship. In another life where she hadn't suffered the disgrace of being pregnant with another man's child. Luke trailed back from the creek, his footsteps slow. How could he have made such a greenhorn error? He helped to make Thomas and Eliza's home, so he was well aware nails were necessary. Now he had to waste several days by going all the way to Council Grove to fetch what most men would have remembered when gathering supplies from the last store before their destination. He recalled leaving Council Grove and how eager he had been to get back on the road and arrive at Walton Valley. Absence had not made the heart fonder. If anything, Hannah was even more prickly toward him than she'd been before he left for Topeka to stake his claim. Was he making a huge mistake settling in Walton Valley? For once, his morning prayers had not helped him. Usually, talking to God made him feel more positive about the day ahead and his choices. Luke examined his reasons for building his home here. He wanted to belong to a community of like-minded people. He hoped to build a church to preach in. And more than anything, he aspired to bring Hannah back to the Lord. When making his goals, he didn't think they were particularly lofty. They were the things he and Silas had talked about on an evening as they camped between towns. With his head resting on his bedroll and eyes heavenward, everything had seemed possible. If they had the money, one more town, Luke had promised his friend. Then we'll have enough money to settle. Except when he'd finally gained the amount he decided was enough, he no longer had Silas. You finished shilly-shallying around? I've been washing, Luke raised an eyebrow at Harry, and praying. Hey. Harry held his hands out in front of his body. I prayed this morning. You did? Don't look so skeptical, preacher. I prayed. Luke grinned. I believe you. Told you I'd take the baptism thing seriously. I'm very proud of you, Harry. Harry snuck a sidelong look at Luke. Hannah is helping me. With your prayers? Luke didn't even try to keep the disbelieving note from his voice. Harry's returning smile could only be described as smug. That's right. How did you convince her to do that? I just asked. Luke shook his head in consternation. I don't understand. She will not hold a conversation with me about God, but she will help you? Why? 'Cause I asked. Harry wagged a finger in Luke's direction. Don't you remember what we talked about yesterday? About not preaching at Hannah. You just need to talk to her like a regular fella. That's what you did. I find that mostly, if you just ask folk for help, they'll give it. Luke understood Harry's point. She hasn't asked me for help. I'm offering it. Harry cackled. Exactly. You need to wait until she needs you to help her. I feel like I'll be waiting forever until Hannah needs my help. Luke stared balefully at Thomas and Eliza's cabin. What can I possibly help her with? Did you carry water for her yesterday? I did, but she didn't want to talk to me. She walked away. Maybe there's something else you can do for her today? Harry looked in the opposite direction toward Grace's home. Talking of which, I'm going to see if there's anything I can do for Mrs. Mitchell before breakfast. With a wink, Harry limped off, whistling a jaunty tune. Surely the old man couldn't think that a refined woman like Grace Mitchell could be attracted to a crusty old trail guide like him. Luke grimaced. In reality, if they were back east, Harry would have about as much business in Grace's social circle as Luke had in Hannah's. Except, of course, they weren't back east. They were in the middle of the Kansas prairie, where such things as social circles did not exist. In Walton Valley, they were all just pioneers forging their way on the land, each equal to the other regardless of their backgrounds. He wished he could convince himself of that. The truth was, he wasn't sure he would ever feel clean enough to even be in the presence of a lady like Hannah, and that had nothing to do with how many times he washed in the creek. Luke walked over to Thomas's cabin and squared his shoulders. It was pointless trying to run before he could walk. He had to show Hannah he could be a good friend, and someone she could rely on. Maybe then she would begin to trust him. He raised his hand to rap on the door. If Hannah allowed him to carry her things to the wagon for the trip to Council Grove, he would see that as a victory. a small one, but nevertheless, a win that he could build upon. Hannah allowed Thomas to help her up onto the buckboard next to Luke. Harry had already sat himself in the back of the wagon with the goods Eliza was sending for sale at the store. Grace had sent a basket of food for their trip. She looked at her sister, wishing Eliza would change her mind and tell Hannah she would take the items for sale herself next month when she traveled with Thomas back to Independence for the trial of their uncle. "Have a safe trip," Eliza called, mopping at her eyes with the edge of her apron. Hannah pressed her lips together firmly. She would not cry. Not in front of Luke, who would only offer her some verse from the Bible that was supposed to comfort her. Never had she been separated from her sister. They hadn't even spent one night away from each other. Thomas put an arm around Eliza's shoulders and pulled her close. Why was Eliza making her go if it distressed her so much? "You know where you're going, boy?" Harry asked as Luke picked up the reins. "Even I can follow these tracks," Luke called back good-naturedly. Hannah looked back at the group of people she lived with who had all become so dear to her. She raised a hand and waved as Luke clicked his tongue and the wagon moved forward. The journey to Council Grove would take them the better part of the day. The two men intended to sleep in the flat bed of the wagon, but Hannah would stay at one of the guest houses. Panic flooded through her. It had all seemed so reasonable when they discussed it in the safety of Walton Valley. Now, as the wheels turned and she was transported away from everyone and everything she held dear, she didn't want to stay in a room by herself. She closed her eyes. "Please, God, make Eliza change her mind. Make something happen so I don't have to stay in Council Grove by myself. I'm scared." The last words of her silent prayer sent a shudder through her body. Why hadn't she just admitted to Eliza how afraid she was? Hannah blinked. What was she doing praying to a God who had long since stopped listening to her? Where was he when Uncle Philip had cornered her in her hotel room in Independence? He had been nowhere, and Hannah had been all alone. "How about a song, Hannah girl?" Harry asked. "You have a sweet voice." The only songs she knew were hymns. No doubt Luke would think 2 minutes in his presence had restored her faith. Singing, however, was better than being stuck in a conversation with Luke about how she needed to trust in the Lord, and he was always there for her. Hours later, Luke brought the wagon to a shuddering halt. She had long ago stopped singing, and the only sound breaking the silence on the desolate prairie was Harry's snores. "Why are we stopping?" Luke turned to her, a frown etched into his face. "I don't like the look of those clouds. We need to get to town as fast as we can and find shelter. We can't outrun a storm, Hannah. I think we're going to have to make our own shelter." She looked around pointedly. "There's nothing here, just empty prairie as far as I can see." Luke turned around and shook Harry awake. It didn't take the old man long to assess the situation. He sat upright, with his head cocked on one side. Eventually, he shook his head, all his usual jovial demeanor replaced by a seriousness that unsettled Hannah. "What is it?" Luke asked. "You hear that?" "I don't hear anything," Luke responded. Dread crept down Hannah's spine, and she shivered. "What's wrong?" Harry turned serious eyes toward her, and suddenly she didn't want to hear his answer. "Twister." Hannah looked from side to side in alarm, as though a whirling tunnel of disaster had crept up on them without her noticing. "I don't see anything." "You can't see anything at this stage," Harry said. "It's the quiet that alerts you to the fact all is not well. The world is too still." She had heard of tornadoes, but she'd never seen one. The extent of her knowledge was that they could devastate entire communities in seconds. Immediately she thought of Walton Valley, of her sister and her husband, Eli, George, and Grace, who had been so kind to her, and the like Chalk and Cheese Prescott brothers. "What should we do?" Luke asked urgently. "We're near Council Grove now. Let's keep going. We have to hope we reach somewhere with a storm cellar before it hits." "And if we don't?" Hannah couldn't help asking. "Then we hunker down and pray," Harry said seriously. Luke flicked the reins and the wagon lurched forward again. Hannah swallowed past the lump in her throat. Her heart felt as though it was beating right there, preventing her from taking a deep breath. They had gotten little farther when a ramshackle building came into view. It looked deserted. Harry jumped down from the wagon and helped Hannah to the ground. She stared at the dilapidated building with dismay. Do you really think that is going to keep us safe? Luke pulled on the brake and looked around. It's our only choice. The wind had increased in the few minutes since they last stopped. Hannah's hair whipped around her face, and she struggled to hold it back, so she could see to walk forward while holding her skirts down. Get her inside, Harry called. Hannah looked behind her at the gathering cloud that was racing across the prairie floor. In contrast to the previous silence, all she could hear now was a loud whooshing sound. Luke grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the shack. Opening the door, he pushed Hannah in before slamming it shut behind him. Hannah was about to ask about Harry when Luke shoved her to the floor and covered her body with his own. Dear Lord, Luke prayed, please keep us safe. I know I haven't always deserved your favor, but I am begging for it now. Please save Hannah and her child. The wind drowned out his words as it screamed around them. A crash sounded, and Luke grunted above her. Hannah held her hands over her belly as tears poured down her face. Silently, she whispered repeatedly, I'll do anything you want, God. Just please let nothing happen to my baby. Chapter 4. Hannah? Luke shifted his body to the side. He could hear her crying quietly, but she didn't answer him. Now was definitely not the time for her to continue her campaign of dislike against him. Hannah, please speak to me. She sniffled, then rolled onto her side to face him. Are we really alive? Should we pinch each other to check? Luke was only half joking. He could see the sky directly above him, where once there had been a roof on the cabin. Miraculously, the four walls were still standing. She reached out a tentative hand. You're hurt. Something hit my head. He raised his hand to check out the damage, but she swatted it away. Don't go poking around, you'll make it worse. Hannah awkwardly moved onto her knees and from there pushed herself upright. I need to find something I can use to clean your wound. Luke wished he hadn't had to take a blow to the head for Hannah to be nice to him. She moved toward the door and he got hurriedly to his feet. Let me check outside first. We don't know if it's safe to open the door. Can't you just sit still and let me tend to your head before you act all manly? She moved over to him and pushed his shoulder until he sat back on the floor. He couldn't argue with her when she had a very valid point. As soon as he tried to stand, the floor of the cabin wobbled before his eyes, and his head felt too heavy for his neck to support. The pain in his head when he tried to move made Luke too afraid to nod in agreement, so he smiled at Hannah instead. She didn't return the sentiment before she walked back over to the door and pulled it open. Her gasp had him in motion once more, but Hannah turned around and pointed a finger at him. Stay. Luke liked it better when she acted concerned for his injury, not when she spoke to him like he was a dog. Still, stay was an enormous improvement on go away. She returned moments later with 2 long strips of material. He tried not to jerk his head away as she dabbed at his scalp. That stings. It's little more than a scratch, she protested. Now hold still. It feels like I've got a hole in my head. Luke lifted a hand, and Hannah pierced him with a glare. It's bleeding. Yes, she retorted. I can see that. If you would stop wriggling like an impatient child and let me see where precisely you're bleeding from, I can bandage the wound. That will have to suffice until we can find help. He didn't want to hear the answer, but he asked anyway. Are the horse and wagon gone? There's no sign of them. Hannah bit her lip and blinked rapidly. I don't see Harry either. Then where did you get that material from? Luke indicated the long band of material in her hand. There are some questions a man should not ask a lady, Hannah said primly. He knew that. But what did that have to do with the material? Suddenly the answer came to him. She had torn her petticoat, so she had something to use on his wound. Gratitude flooded through him. Thank you. Hannah pulled back. This does not mean we're friends. No, ma'am. I simply do not want your death on my conscience. Of course, Luke agreed affably, not caring that she seemed determined to persuade him that her care for him was only because he was injured. He would take that. It was a beginning. She finished winding the makeshift bandage around his head, then dusted off her hands. Now, do you think you can stand without falling over? I don't know, he said honestly. Will you try? Yes, Luke said, feeling chastened by her impatient tone. Maybe I should use the wall for support. Hannah looked at the wall and then back at Luke, where he sat in the middle of the small room. Okay. Could you maybe turn your back? Could you maybe swallow your pride and get on with it? Hannah stuck a hand on either hip. Hurry, I want to look for Harry. Luke moved onto all fours and crawled over to the wall, his head pounding with every movement. He eventually got to his feet and leaned back heavily on the wall with his eyes closed. Sweat ran down his forehead into his eyes, and he sucked in air through his mouth. Fainting in front of any woman, but particularly this one, was not an option. She walked back to his side and wiped his brow. Your face is as white as the clouds outside. He wanted to tell her that her observation was not helpful, but as it was the two of them against the elements, he bit down on that response. I've felt better. You've looked better. He couldn't help himself. I'm glad you've noticed. Hannah shook her head. You have an entirely too inflated opinion of yourself. If only she knew. Luke couldn't stand to look at himself. That only reminded him of what Silas saw every time he looked his way. Someone he trusted, looked up to, and respected. He didn't deserve his friend's admiration or confidence. His actions had led directly to Silas's death. He edged himself toward the open doorway and looked out. The sky was dim, no longer because of the impending storm, but because the sun was setting. That couldn't be right. It was mid-afternoon when the tornado hit, shortly after they'd stopped for lunch. It'll be dark in a few hours. I'm glad you noticed, she said tartly, but I don't understand. You were unconscious. Luke now understood her tears and initial hesitation when he called her name. She must have believed she was trapped underneath a dead man. I must have been out for hours. Yes, she whispered. I thought at first you would wake up, or Harry would come and help us. You must have been terrified. He wanted to reach out and comfort her, or praise God they were both safe. But Harry's advice came back to him. Be her friend first. I'm sorry you were scared. Hannah lifted her chin. I was worried about my baby. Tell me what I can do to make you feel better? Take me home, Luke, she said, her bottom lip wobbling. Hannah folded her arms around her middle, accentuating the bulge of her stomach where her child rested. I don't think I can do that tonight, he replied honestly. But Council Grove is not far. Maybe someone there can help us get back to Walton Valley. We've lost everything, she whimpered. All of Eliza's hard work. And Harry, poor Harry. Not everything is lost. Luke couldn't resist reaching out and tucking a blonde strand of hair behind her ear. He wanted to tell her they had each other and they would get through the night safely, then set out to Council Grove the next morning. But he knew that wasn't what she would want to hear. Your sister will not care about the items she prepared for sale. She will simply be glad you are alive and uninjured. We've lost our food, our water, our friend. Hannah stared at Luke. How can you be so calm? Are you not angry? I'm every bit as cross and scared as you are, Hannah. He tried not to care how much he liked the sound of her name on his lips. I like Harry very much too. She pressed her lips together and dropped her hands to her side. You should stay here. I didn't think you could get any paler, but it seems you've proven me wrong. I'll have a quick look around and see if your God has sent us any miracles in the form of food or water. Maybe Harry is lying injured somewhere. Luke wished he could argue with her, but her assessment of his health was correct. He was certain that if he moved from the door of the cabin, he would fall. The indignity of crawling across the dirt floor of their temporary shelter was fresh in his mind. It wasn't something he wanted to repeat. Please don't go far. Hannah gave a quick nod and stepped away. She might still be angry with God, but that didn't stop him from offering a prayer for her safety. His regard for her increased as she set off at a determined pace. Not once had she complained about herself or her own discomfort. Her concern was only for his injury and for Harry. Luke closed his eyes and added a prayer for God to give him the strength to care for Hannah and her child. He would need all the help he could get for the walk to Council Grove the next morning. A loud rattling on the flimsy door of the shack awoke Hannah. Rubbing her eyes, she elbowed Luke in the ribs as she struggled to get to her feet. "There's someone outside," she whispered. Her words were unnecessary. In her haste to get to the door and open the wooden bar they had lowered the night before, giving themselves a modicum of security, she stumbled over Luke's foot. He pushed himself to his knees and caught her before she hit the floor. At that moment, the door flew inward, and 2 men stumbled into the small room. "Are they in there?" a voice called from outside. "Harry," Hannah called back, delighted to hear the old man's voice. She turned to Luke. "It's Harry. He's all right." The 2 strangers looked between Hannah and Luke. She flushed and disentangled herself from his arms. How must their situation look to them? Not only was she in his arms, but they had clearly spent the night together. "Are you all right, ma'am?" The older of the 2 men moved forward, a shining star on his shirt displaying that he was a sheriff. His gaze, however, bore into Luke. "I'm starving," Hannah replied, then wished she hadn't spoken as the other man raised an eyebrow in her direction. She couldn't help her words. All she had thought of when she eventually fell asleep was food. She had watched the light of the moon fade and the stars disappear from the night sky before her eyes fluttered closed. It had seemed only a matter of minutes until the noise outside had awakened her. "We sheltered here when the tornado hit," Luke said, as he helped Hannah to her feet. "Together?" the sheriff asked, then peered more closely at Luke. "Say, is that you, preacher?" "Yes, it's me," Luke answered. His voice was weak and held none of its usual vitality. "Mr. Johnson really needs to see a doctor," Hannah said. "He took a terrible blow to the head protecting me." "Is that so?" the sheriff scratched his belly. "You 2 better come into town with us. I guess there's plenty of time to discuss your situation after you've both eaten and seen the doc." The hairs on the back of Hannah's neck prickled. There was something in the sheriff's tone that alarmed her. "Our situation." Harry pushed past the second man, who was yet to speak. "You know, Hannah girl, with you both being out here all night, by yourselves like." "We were stranded," Hannah protested. Realizing where this conversation was heading, Luke was unconscious. By the time he came round, it was too late to walk into town. He really needs to see a doctor. "Yeah, he don't look too good," Harry agreed. The sheriff and his deputy stepped toward Luke and supported him on either side as they helped him walk out to the waiting wagon. Hannah waited patiently as Luke and Harry were helped into the back. Her whole body ached from sleeping on the hard-packed ground, and she arched her back and rolled her shoulders. "I guess you'll be needing help to get up, ma'am?" the sheriff asked, looking pointedly at her midsection. "I can manage," Hannah muttered. "I'm sure you can," he replied, "but I'll still help you." Once they were seated on the buckboard, he flicked the reins and his team of horses walked forward. Hannah fidgeted on the hard wooden seat, unable to get comfortable. She remembered thinking once that she would never become accustomed to sleeping on the floor after the luxurious bed in her hotel suite in Independence. Now she couldn't wait to get back to Walton Valley. Anything was better than the night she had just endured. "Looks like Preacher Johnson has a good reason for settling in that new community." The sheriff looked straight ahead. Even though his eyes were not on her, she felt the weight of his accusation. "I can assure you that Mr. Johnson's reasons for settling in Walton Valley have nothing whatsoever to do with me," she said, haughtily in her crisp English accent. "And yet, pardon me, ma'am, but you're in the family way." "I do not pardon your impertinence," Hannah said, her temper rising. "I don't even know your name, and yet you presume to talk to me about incredibly personal matters that, quite frankly, have nothing whatsoever to do with you." "Sheriff Ned Norton, ma'am." He lifted his hat from his head and nodded in her direction. Hannah pursed her lips and looked away. She would not share so much as her name with this man who was seeking to judge both her and Luke, even though they had done nothing wrong. She turned to Harry. "What have you got to say for yourself?" He shrugged. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean. When the tornado had moved along, I saw you were both injured, and I walked all the way into town for help." "Couldn't help have come quicker," Hannah hissed. "Perhaps last night." "Naw," Harry replied. "Too much going on in town for anyone to rush out and help 2 travelers. This was the earliest the sheriff here would come out for you both, and I had to talk him into coming this early. You can see how this looks to him. Hannah jerked a thumb in the sheriff's direction. I can. A devilish smile creased across Harry's cheeks. The good Lord works in mysterious ways, don't he? What is that supposed to mean? I've been praying for something to happen and help you in your predicament, Harry said piously. And now it has. Oh no, Hannah shook her head. You're all making a mountain out of what isn't even a tiny mound of earth. It's a splendid solution for you, Harry went on. Preacher Luke is a good man, and I happen to know he's right sweet on you. I am right here, you know. Luke opened one eye, groaned, then closed it again. I can hear everything you're all saying. Well then, tell them how ridiculous it is. Luke shrugged. I can certainly see how it looks like you've been compromised. Compromised? Hannah fumed. I think that happened some time ago. It's not possible for a ruined woman to be ruined again. Now, Hannah girl, Harry said, you calm yourself down. No use getting all riled up. You know I don't like it when you talk about yourself like that. Tears stung behind her eyes. She hadn't believed that things could get any worse for her, but this was definitely a very sorrier position. She was stuck in yet another situation she could see no way out of, and, worse, this time she didn't have her sister to rescue her. The wagon lumbered on toward Council Grove, and Luke was grateful the conversation did not continue. Following what was being said and by whom was hard enough, but each time the wagon rolled over a bump in the ground, it felt as though a firecracker had exploded inside his skull. The main gist of the conversation seemed to be that he needed to marry Hannah to protect her reputation. Surely any reasonable man could see that the night they had spent together in the ramshackle old building had been born out of necessity, though even he had to admit that it was unfortunate that the door had opened just as Hannah had fallen. Harry seemed positively ecstatic at the turn of events. Luke tried to remember what happened immediately prior to the tornado. Harry had been concerned about the silence. The sky had gone from blue with fat white clouds meandering along on a slight breeze to dark and dangerous. He had run with Hannah toward the shack and been sure Harry was right behind them. Luke closed his eyes. There was no way Harry could have engineered the situation. He was just as lucky as Luke and Hannah not to be dead. As they approached what was the last town on the Santa Fe Trail, Luke noticed the damage caused by the tornado was mostly to the outskirts. The center of town was largely untouched. The sheriff and his deputy helped him down from the wagon, and he stood unsteadily on the sidewalk. Is this the doctor's office? Hannah asked, uncertainty lacing her words. This is the jail, the sheriff replied. Jail, Luke echoed. Why? Figured the mayor might have something to say about you two being together all night. He might want you charged. Hannah put her hands on her hips. You will have to throw me bodily into a cell. I refuse to be a party to such ridiculousness. The sheriff looked at Hannah's belly and scratched his head. Now, ma'am, I'm sure there's no call for anyone to be thrown anywhere. The lady needs to see the doctor, Luke said calmly. I will happily sit in a cell until you resolve this nonsense to your satisfaction. Luke, no, your need to see a doctor is far greater than mine. Luke held out his wrist to the sheriff. I don't agree, Hannah. Now, sheriff, you may take me into a cell, but I insist the lady is seen by the doctor immediately. Sheriff Norton glanced from Luke to the jail behind him. Ain't no call for cuffs. You just walk in and take a seat on the cot in the first cell. I trust you, preacher. You don't trust him that much. Otherwise, you wouldn't be putting him in jail. Hannah moved in front of the entrance, her feet planted slightly apart. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, she had dirt on her face, and her dress looked like it had been used to clean the old cabin they'd sheltered in. He doubted he looked any more presentable. You have to admit that the circumstances in which we found you were less than acceptable. The sheriff reached out a hand and touched Hannah's elbow. Now, please move aside. I will not. She shook the sheriff's hand from her arm and glared at him. Luke had to admire her courage. She must be terrified. He might not know the full circumstances of her past, but he knew enough to be certain standing up to a man of authority was very plucky. Now see here. Harry moved next to Hannah. Hannah, girl, people are taking notice of what's happening here. Her gaze moved away from the sheriff, and she adjusted her feet to the side so she could see beyond him. Shame flooded her cheeks, and her hands fluttered up to her face and then down to her belly. Luke could tell the very moment she realized how her appearance would look to the gathering group of townfolk. "This discussion is not over," Hannah muttered fiercely to the sheriff, before moving away from the entrance to the jail. "I'll fetch the doctor for you now, Luke." Her blue eyes rested on him, and she smiled. Luke suddenly couldn't care less if he had to spend the rest of his life in the dingy town jail. That one smile was worth it. And the parts of himself he thought couldn't be reached again after Silas's death warmed. And for the first time in months, he wondered if God's plan for him could contain much more than just being a traveling preacher. Chapter 5. Hannah moved away from the jail as though she were being hounded by a pack of wild animals. No one moved to follow her and Harry, but their voices chased her along the sidewalk. "Who is that woman?" "No decent girl would be seen like that in public." "I heard she spent the night with that nice preacher." While she tried to ignore their words as meaningless gossip, she knew how these things worked. It was pointless facing down the group and giving some meaning to their accusations. The only part they would hear was her admission that she had, in fact, spent the night with Luke Johnson. She didn't think they would care that it had happened because of the tornado or Luke's injury, but she knew she had done nothing wrong, and neither had Luke. Nothing improper had happened between them. Despite her feelings about the preacher, he was an honorable man. Even if he had not spent a good deal of their time unconscious, she knew he would not have made any improper advances. "The doctor is this way, just past the store." Harry rested a hand on the small of her back as he shuffled along next to her. "Thank you, Harry," she turned to him as a thought occurred to her. "How did you come to be in Council Grove while Luke and I were in that awful shack all night?" "I tried to save the wagon and the horse," he explained. "Once that twister was right on me, I threw myself to the ground and just prayed. When I opened my eyes, our things were gone. You and the preacher were not moving. I walked for help." "You walked all the way into Council Grove?" Harry puffed out his chest a little. "I surely did." "Your leg must be terribly sore." "Now you mention it, Hannah girl," Harry confessed. "It feels like the fires of hell are attacking it with every step I take." "You silly man." Hannah put an arm around his back and drew him closer to her. "Let me support you." "Goodness gracious, girl." Harry stopped walking and moved a step backward. "Isn't it enough that the entire town is talking about you and the preacher? Now you want them to start talking about me and you too?" He couldn't be serious, could he? She searched his face. None of the usual merriment was clear in the craggy lines of his face. "I'm simply offering you a friendly helping hand." "We know that." Harry jerked a thumb behind them in the jail's direction. "They don't. Now let's get to the doctor's office before you get any more tongues wagging." Hannah couldn't think of anything to say other than simple acquiescence. "All right," Harry waggled his eyebrows. "Unless, of course, you want to marry me instead of the preacher." Now she knew he was joking. "I don't want to marry either of you." Harry threw a hand over his chest. "You've broken my old heart, Hannah girl." She smiled as they walked together in the direction Harry indicated. Maybe things weren't as bad as they seemed. The doctor's wife opened the door and gave Hannah a disapproving glance before focusing her attention on Harry. "What can I do for you folk?" "The lady here," Harry emphasized the word, just as Luke had done, "needs to see the doctor. It may interest you to know that she is the niece of Lord Cheston." "Lord Cheston," she repeated, as though the name should mean something to her. "From London, England," Harry said in a haughty voice. Now was not the best time to explain to Harry that her Uncle Edward didn't live in London. But to Hannah's surprise, the mention of his name changed the other woman's demeanor. Never for a moment had she believed anyone out here in this frontier town had heard of her family. "You should have said so earlier. Do come in." Hannah hid a smile at the voice the woman affected. Her vowels were suddenly elongated, and her words carefully pronounced. "Nancy?" An older gentleman peered at Hannah and Harry. "Who do we have here?" "My name is Hannah Fairchild. I'm pleased to meet you." Hannah put out a hand. "I traveled to Council Grove with 2 friends, Mr. Harry Walton here and a preacher you may know, Luke Johnson. Yes, indeed. The doctor shook Hannah's hand. The preacher is well known in these parts. I am the town doctor, John Garfield. How may I help you? Luke. Hannah cleared her throat. When had he stopped being that annoying preacher and become plain Luke? That is, Mr. Johnson sustained a rather severe blow to the head because of falling debris. He requires your attention. When did this accident happen? Yesterday afternoon. The tornado caught us as we were traveling. Yes, the doctor shook his head sadly. That incident has kept me busy. Praise God, we have suffered no fatalities. Hannah's instinct was to open her mouth and refute the suggestion that the lack of deaths had something to do with God. But she remembered her first instinct when she hit the dirt floor of the shack, and Luke had covered her protectively with his own body. She had prayed. She had asked him to save her child. And he had. Was it possible that he listened to her prayers after all? Unfortunately, Mr. Johnson has been detained by the sheriff. I wonder, is it possible for you to attend to him in the jail? The doctor's brow furrowed. Why has the sheriff arrested the preacher? Hannah met his eyes directly. She had nothing to be ashamed of. I don't know that he has been arrested, but apparently the sheriff is to discuss the matter with the mayor to see if they can make charges against Mr. Johnson. But what for? Dr. Garfield asked. Mr. Johnson and I took shelter from the tornado in an abandoned building. He lifted an eyebrow. That seems a reasonable thing for you both to do. We were there all night until they rescued us this morning. Nancy Garfield gasped and fanned her face. How disgraceful. Do you have no shame, young woman? It seemed the good impression she had made on Mrs. Garfield when the other woman became aware she was the niece of an earl had now been destroyed. Hannah stifled a sigh. It seemed ruining things was becoming a pattern of her life. She jumped forward as Mrs. Garfield swayed on her feet. Doctor, your wife is swooning. The doctor grasped his wife's elbows and steered her to a seat. She never collapses unless there's someone there to catch her. Nancy reads way too many silly novels. Let us go see the preacher. Dr. Garfield grabbed his medical bag and patted his wife's shoulder as he walked past her toward the door. You will be fine, my love. Stay right there until I return. Hannah frowned at the stern tone the doctor used when addressing his wife. He closed the door behind them. Will she be all right by herself? She won't be by herself for long. How can you be so sure? The only thing Nancy likes more than reading those books is gossip. You have just admitted to spending the night with a man. He waved a dismissive hand as she prepared to excuse the situation she and Luke had been in. You don't need to defend yourself to me, Miss Fairchild. I completely understand your predicament. Sadly, I do not think that will be the case with most of those in town. It was so unfair, but Hannah resolved not to give it another thought. Why did it matter what a lot of closed-minded people in a town she didn't live in thought about her? All they had to do was get Luke patched up by the doctor and work out some way of getting back to Walton Valley, where she was universally loved and not judged by events that were out of her control. Luke struggled to sit up as Hannah and Harry returned to the jail with the doctor. He hated Hannah was seeing him in such a place. It didn't matter that she knew he hadn't committed a crime. The fact he was behind bars was demoralizing. Ned, get this door open, Dr. Garfield demanded as he grasped the bars and shook them for emphasis. I cannot believe you have actually locked the preacher in. Look at the man. He's hardly going to make a run for it, is he? The sheriff grabbed a key from the chain around his waist and unlocked the door. Can't be too careful, Doc. Just look at the state of the pair of them. They were caught in a natural disaster, man. What were they supposed to do? But the sheriff looked at Hannah, and that seemed to reinvigorate his argument. You must have noticed her condition. The doctor glared at the sheriff. You cannot be so dim-witted that you hold the preacher responsible for Miss Fairchild's condition. That does not happen overnight, and a man of your years should sufficiently know how babies are both made and the time it takes for them to grow. Luke stole a glance at Hannah. Her eyes were downcast, a faint blush staining her cheeks a pretty pink. He hated she was now going through more indignities, simply because he had been struck on the head. If that hadn't happened, they would have arrived in Council Grove the evening before. The sheriff retreated to his desk and yanked out his chair. It squeaked loudly on the rough wooden floor in protest at his roughness. "Ain't no call for rudeness." "There isn't a call to jail an injured man for taking care of a young woman either, but you seem to have done just that." "It ain't right." The sheriff raised his booted feet and rested them on the corner of his desk. "You mark my word, the mayor will see this the same way as me. They'll have to get wed. If he insists on a marriage, then he is as stupid and short-sighted as you." The doctor turned his back on the sheriff and approached the cot. "Lay back down, son. Be best to do that before you fall and injure yourself more than you already have." Gratefully, Luke swung his legs around and turned onto his left side. "Thank you, Doc." "I can only do so much," he replied. "You know how folk can be. If they decide there must be a wedding, then that's what will happen. Are you prepared to marry Miss Fairchild?" "Yes," Luke said without hesitation, then lowered his voice. "Hannah is a sweet girl, her uncle. That is, the baby is not because of any flaw in her character." "I understand. Now let's have a look at your head." Dr. Garfield unwound the material from Luke's head. "Miss Fairchild bound your wound?" "She went outside," Luke explained. "Tore off the material and then tended to my cut. There truly was nothing improper about the time we spent together. It isn't me you need to convince, young man, though I have to say it says much for your character that you are willing to marry her." "How does it look?" Luke was wary of the answer. He hated the idea of needing stitches or some other painful procedure, while Hannah was sitting right there opposite the sheriff. The indignity of needing to be helped to walk was still fresh in his mind. Her blue eyes met his, and her tentative smile went some way to relaxing her anxious face. His spirits lifted. Perhaps they could be friends after all. "The cut is superficial," the doctor reported. "However, you have a rather large egg on your head. You must have a mighty powerful headache?" Luke had learned that nodding made the ailment the doctor suggested much worse. "Yes, I have." "Were you knocked out?" "I believe so." Luke looked over at Hannah. "Miss Fairchild will know more about that than I." "Of course." Dr. Garfield turned around to face Hannah. "Can you tell me more about Mr. Johnson's condition immediately after the injury?" Even with the distance between them, Luke could see Hannah's eyes fill with tears. She sucked in a shuddering breath. "I thought he was dead." Her reaction must mean she cared about him. What other reason could there be for her show of emotion? "He was unconscious?" "Yes," she confirmed. "And for hours. When he finally came around, I believed I was dreaming. I had been praying for him to recover, of course, but initially I thought I was hearing things." Hannah had prayed for him. Luke couldn't help the foolish grin that creased his cheeks. She was not as unaffected by him as she pretended. How was he when he regained consciousness? Was he able to talk normally? "Yes, but he was unsteady on his feet." Hannah bit her lip. "That's why we could not walk to town. Luke wasn't well enough, and it was already getting dark. We stayed where we were and planned to set out this morning if his condition was improved." "How would you describe his symptoms when he awoke? Was he alert and coherent?" "Yes," Hannah said, shooting a glance at Luke, though he needed help to get to the wagon and then again into the jail. Dr. Garfield marched from the jail and up to the sheriff. He knocked the man's legs from his desk and perched himself on the corner. "That man needs to be taken to my office immediately. He needs regular checks and medicine for his pain. His head injury could be very serious." "He's my prisoner," the sheriff said stubbornly. "I can watch him here, and you can bring him medicine." "Ned." The doctor slapped the table, causing the lawman to jump. "I insist my assessment of my patient is given proper consideration." "But the mayor." "If the mayor decides the preacher's sins are severe enough to require his arrest, then you can do that when he is well enough." He could escape. "I am losing patience, Ned." The doctor smoothed down his white whiskers. "If you want to station a deputy outside my offices, then so be it. But I demand he be moved immediately so I can properly tend to him. He needs quiet and rest in a proper bed to recover." The words were a balm to Luke's aching head. Right then, he'd likely agree to marry the doctor if someone insisted upon it. He was so grateful to the man. "I have business at the store," Hannah said. "Perhaps I can visit your patient afterward." "Young lady," the doctor pointed at her, "you cannot go walking around the town like that. You will accompany me back to my offices. Nancy will help you tidy up, and then I will examine you before I agree to you traipsing around." "But," he held up a hand, "I shall not take any arguments." Luke smothered a grin. The kindly older man was doing everything he could to help them. "While you're being seen to," Harry gestured between Luke and Hannah, "I'll see if anyone has found any sign of our horse or wagon." "Plan on being in town for at least the next 48 hours, Dr. Garfield said sternly. "Yes, sir." Harry gave a salute as he left the jail. Luke hadn't even considered what they would do about getting home. Eliza would be frantic when they didn't return that evening. He wondered what it would be like to have someone as concerned for him as Hannah's sister would be for her. It had been so long since he had enjoyed the loving comfort of a family. After Silas's death, he hadn't believed he deserved such a luxury, but it didn't stop him from wanting it, now more than ever. Hannah followed behind the men toward the doctor's office. She was aware of people staring and pointing. They could well be discussing how strange it was to see a man leaving the jail and being helped to walk along the sidewalk. But she could see their attention was trained on her. The doctor's words about his wife's love of gossip came back to her, and she sighed inwardly. If they blackened her character when she arrived in town, it was now positively destroyed. If the shocked looks and whispered comments were anything to go by. "Nancy," the doctor called as he entered. He shook his head. "Where has that woman gone now?" Probably to spread the word, and not the good word that Luke preached, but the one that had been passed around the community, about her and the night she'd spent with Luke. "Please take a seat, dear." The doctor indicated a chair for Hannah before he directed a side room for Luke to be taken into. Alone for the first time in what felt like days, Hannah replayed the events of the previous day in her mind. There was nothing she or Luke could have done any differently. He had risked his own safety to protect her and her baby. She would be forever grateful to him for that. A few answered prayers did not mean her relationship with God was healed, but it meant that she had some evidence of his mercy. If only there were some way of letting her sister know she was safe. She gasped as something new occurred to her. Why hadn't she thought about Walton Valley before now? Just because they were heading away from home when the tornado hit did not mean the devastating twister hadn't touched down there before moving toward Council Grove. An urgency to return home overwhelmed Hannah. She didn't want to wait the 48 hours the doctor had stipulated for Luke's recovery. Surely Harry would take her home that very day. Only they had no means to get home, and the items she had brought for sale in the store were lost. Helplessness washed over her, and she fought to keep her emotions from spilling over. Crying would not help. She ignored the whisper that told her to pray for an answer. God had kept her, Luke, and the baby safe. His goodwill toward her must now be complete. The doctor came out of the room and beckoned Hannah. "Follow me to my personal quarters, and I will examine you. The preacher is resting comfortably." The sheriff left, shaking his head as he went, leaving Hannah alone with a man she did not know. Not that knowledge of a man gave her any measure of safety. Sweat broke out on her forehead and her hands shook. She looked wildly around the room. Could she make it to the door before he stopped her? He took a step toward her, and suddenly the doctor's kindly face changed into that of her uncle's. She screamed, and even as she commanded her legs to move, they trembled so violently she didn't think they would take her anywhere, even if she could make herself stand. "Hannah," Luke called moments before the door to the side room flew open, and he hurried to her side. Dr. Garfield held his hands up in front of his body. "I didn't." Hannah looked at him in horror. Gone was Uncle Philip's face, and the doctor's concerned face was back. He smoothed his whiskers and smiled gently. "I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me." "Dear girl," the doctor said, "I think we all know exactly what upset you. It is I who should apologize. It was thoughtless of me to suggest you go anywhere with me alone, and pure stupidity to approach you. Please forgive me." "There's nothing to forgive," Hannah murmured. "You were simply trying to help me." Let us go in here, he suggested, indicating the room Luke had vacated. Would you feel more comfortable if the preacher were present? Hannah nodded. Yes, thank you. Dr. Garfield pulled a chair to the foot of the bed and turned it to face the door. Sit there. Luke ignored the doctor and waited next to the bed until Hannah was comfortable. Would you like me to hold your hand? She considered his question. While the comfort was exactly what she needed, she didn't think she could bear the indignity of being examined in front of him. I placed the chair in that position for a reason. The doctor pointed at the wooden seat. The last thing this poor child needs is for you to be watching my every move after everything she has been through. How about I promise to close my eyes? Yes, Hannah said. The single word was out before she thought about it. Luke's compromise was perfect. The doctor moved the chair back to the side of the bed and moved around to the other side. Is everybody ready? As I'll ever be, Hannah answered as bravely as she could. Luke squeezed her hand, his fingers settling over the back of her hand. He traced a pattern over her palm with the pad of his thumb. With his other hand, he smoothed back her hair. Everything will be fine, sweetheart. Sweetheart? She wanted to protest at the endearment, but didn't have the energy. The events of the last 24 hours had sapped every ounce of strength she had. Have you felt the baby move since the accident? The doctor let out a merry laugh as he placed his hands on her belly. You don't need to answer that question. Your baby is very active. I think the excitement has kept him awake, Hannah replied. Luke's hand pressed to hers. I'm so glad all is well. Except something. The doctor frowned. Is something wrong? Hannah asked, terror gripping her once more. How much more could she bear? Not wrong, my dear, he clarified. Just a moment. Doc. Luke sounded as serious as she did. Miss Fairchild, the doctor announced. Your baby appears to be very well indeed, as is its sibling. Twins? Luke asked faintly. Twins, Dr. Garfield confirmed. Congratulations. Goodness, Hannah whispered. I wasn't sure how I would manage to care for one child, but two. You'll have lots of help, Luke said, his voice now sounding excited. Your sister, George, Grace, everyone will help. I can see Noah carrying the babies to look at his crops. Josh will read them bedtime stories. It sounds like your children will be exceedingly lucky. Yes, we're all very lucky. Are they moving now? Luke asked. Hannah nodded, excitement winning the war against shock, at least for now. It's as if they both want to make themselves known. Could I? He paused, and Hannah turned to look at him. Would you allow me to feel them move? She lifted their joined hands and moved his to rest on her belly. She pressed his hand against her dress with her own. Can you feel that? I think so, he said, wonder filling his eyes. Oh, yes. How amazing. Isn't it? Dr. Garfield asked. It doesn't matter how many pregnant ladies I have seen in my career. Each one is a miracle. Hannah looked at Luke, and his eyes opened and locked with hers. Thank you for allowing me to share in such a beautiful gift. She didn't want the moment to end. Eliza had been a wonderful support to her over the last few months, but she had not filled the ache in the pit of Hannah's stomach. Right now, that empty place was overflowing, and she didn't want the sweetness to end. The babies moved again under their joined hands, and Hannah recalled the night their life had begun. The horrible memory lodged itself in her mind and stole away her joy. She had no business thinking soft thoughts about Luke or any other man. After what had happened to her, there was no way she could bear to be alone with a man again, even one who looked at her with such wonder in his gaze that she wanted to be the answer to all the questions she could see in his eyes. Chapter 6. I should probably look for my wife, the doctor said awkwardly. Hannah removed her hand from on top of his, and with great reluctance, Luke let his slide down to his side. The magic spell was broken. Regret lanced through him. He wanted to recreate the moment, but he wasn't nearly clever enough to think of a way to encourage Hannah to look at him again, like she thought he was a decent human being and not her enemy. I should move out of your bed, Hannah forced a laugh, looking anywhere but at him. I'm fine here if you need to rest, Luke said, in a desperate attempt to regain the euphoric minute spent feeling Hannah's hand on his, while he experienced the miracle of new life. At the risk of being a killjoy, the doctor interjected, "You are the one who requires rest." His head did feel as though it were too heavy for his shoulders. Whatever medication the doctor had given him was also making him drowsy, but he didn't want to look weak in front of Hannah. Dr. Garfield helped her up into a sitting position, and she moved around the bed to stand next to his chair. "Thank you, Doctor." "You are most welcome, Miss Fairchild." He paused in the doorway of the room. "I will leave this door open. I trust the two of you will not get yourselves into any more trouble while I'm gone. I'm certain I will simply go to sleep." "If you say so, preacher," the doctor turned to Hannah with a smile. "As soon as I locate my wife, she will help you clean up." "I'm very grateful. Hannah, can I ask you something?" She looked at the empty doorway as though she wanted to escape after the doctor. "What is it?" "Will you tell me about your family? What was it like growing up in England?" Hannah smiled, and Luke's world tilted. He grabbed the edges of the bed to ground himself. "I think you know I was raised in great privilege. My Uncle Edward is the Earl of Cheston. Eliza and I lived with our parents in our family's ancestral home until our father moved us to America." Luke frowned. Why did he do that? Life here must certainly be very different. "My father's other brother, Philip, had plans to open a hotel in Independence with his inheritance. He convinced Papa that there were great opportunities in America. I'm afraid to say that my father was rather a dreamer. He had some vague notion of opening a school for orphan children." "That's a very noble idea." Luke thought he would have liked Hannah's father. What he should have done was come to America by himself and see what was possible. Instead, he uprooted us all. "And then?" he asked gently. "I think you know my parents contracted cholera shortly after they arrived. I'm afraid they both perished, leaving Eliza and me at the mercy of our uncle." "Do you miss England?" "I miss our cool summer days." Hannah flapped a hand in front of her face. "The heat in America is quite different to back home. Is there anything else you wish you could have in America that you had back home?" Luke waited for the answer without breathing. Friends did kind things for each other. If he could give her something that she longed for, it may just increase their friendship. "We had the most glorious yellow roses in our garden." She closed her eyes. "Some days, if I try hard enough, I can still recall exactly how they smelled." Luke stored that information away. Hannah liked yellow flowers. His own eyes fluttered closed as the events of the previous day caught up with him. "Sing for me." He heard, rather than saw, her shake her head. "I couldn't. My head hurts." Luke opened one eye to gauge her reaction to his words. "Hearing you sing would help my pain, I'm sure." She grinned. "I know subterfuge when I hear it, preacher." "Is that a yes?" He closed his eyes again. "If it helps you decide, I'm not above begging." "Did your mother sing to you when you were a young boy?" Luke's eyes flew open. "No." She raised an eyebrow at his terse reply. "I'm sorry if that's a difficult subject. I just thought that as you asked me about my family, I'd ask about yours." He fought down his frustration. It wasn't her fault she had touched on the one subject he refused to discuss, with anyone. Though that wasn't true. He wouldn't talk about Silas either. "My mother wasn't the singing kind." That wasn't the truth either. His mother sang, just not the type of songs that were appropriate for a child. He wished he'd never started this conversation. Either that or he'd chosen a completely different subject. What would he do if she asked him about his father? Hannah's family was from the English aristocracy. His were about as far removed from that level of society as it was possible to be. He had no business entertaining ideas about a woman like Hannah. Luke no longer wanted to be trapped on a bed with her sitting by his side, reminding him of all the things that he couldn't have. The lumpy cot in the jail would be preferable. The silence stretched out between them. Luke kept his eyes tightly squeezed closed and willed sleep to overcome him. He heard the rustle of material as Hannah moved, but the last thing he expected was her touch. She smoothed the hair from his forehead, much as he had done to her prior to the doctor's examination. Then she sang. The beauty of her voice and the rhythmic movement of her hand over his hair made tears prick behind his eyes. He closed them tighter. Allowing them to leak out in front of this woman would be the ultimate shame. Silently, he begged for God's forgiveness. He wasn't the man she thought he was. He shouldn't allow her to comfort him. But heaven help him. He didn't have the strength to tell her to stop. So it turned out Luke wasn't quite as bad as she thought he was. She might have noticed that his blue eyes were fringed with dark eyelashes that curled upward, and that he had a cute smattering of freckles across his nose. Some would call him handsome if they were asked, herself included. Fortunately, no one was asking. Just because he was tolerable when he wasn't preaching, and God had answered the last prayer she offered, she cautioned herself against getting enthusiastic about either of them. Nancy had served Hannah a substantial breakfast before helping her to clean her face and fix her hair, but there wasn't much she could do with her gown. She had sponged the worst of the dirt from it, but it still looked grubby. The older woman offered to lend her a dress, but despite Hannah's increased girth, Nancy's figure was still somewhat stouter. The doctor's wife was much more pleasant to Hannah than she had expected following her behavior earlier that morning. She wasn't sure what prompted the woman's pleasant demeanor, but she was glad the talk of marriage had stopped. Her sister had been exceedingly lucky with her husband, Thomas. Although Eliza had married to secure their passage out of independence and away from their abusive uncle, she had fallen in love with Thomas on the journey to Walton Valley. She wanted the unconditional love that was obvious in their marriage for herself. Hannah strode down the sidewalk toward the store. She had no doubt the items Eliza made for sale some weeks ago would have been purchased. There was little hope that Harry would find the things from their wagon, but perhaps the store would owe them enough money they could hire a wagon and horse from the livery to get home. As she approached the building, she noticed people pointing and whispering behind their hands. She looked behind her, but even as she turned her head, Hannah knew she was the source of their gossip. Remembering what Eliza had told her on many occasions, she opened the door of the general store and walked in. She had nothing to be ashamed of. She had done nothing wrong. If other people sought to judge her, she would not condemn them, for it was not her place to do that. Hannah repeated the words over and over, even as the woman behind the counter shook her head and looked away as she walked toward her. "Good morning, I am Hannah Fairchild," she said brightly. "I know who you are. Your sort is not welcome in this respectable establishment." "My sort?" Hannah repeated, even though she had a good idea of what the woman meant. "I have heard from a very reliable source you lured that poor young preacher into an abandoned building. It clearly is not the first time you have engaged in such unseemly behavior." She stared pointedly at Hannah's stomach. The joy she had experienced when Dr. Garfield confirmed that not only was her baby healthy, but that she was expecting 2 babies shattered. It didn't matter that to her that their creation was because of a violent act. She still believed that babies were a gift from God. She intended to love and care for her children to the best of her ability. Hannah lifted her chin and spoke slowly and clearly. "We took shelter from a tornado. Mr. Johnson was knocked unconscious by falling debris and badly injured." The woman shuffled some papers in front of her and didn't look up to meet Hannah's gaze. "That's as may be, but you spent all night with him, unchaperoned." The last word was barked out as though that too was Hannah's fault. "We traveled from Walton Valley with a friend, Mr. Harry Walton. He was unfortunately separated from us because of the tornado. He came to town to get help." "Leaving you alone with Mr. Johnson," she said triumphantly. The palms of Hannah's hands had grown damp, and her cheeks were heated, but she forced herself to keep her tone steady. "As I've said, he was extremely unwell and is currently being treated by the doctor. Neither of us should bear any responsibility for an unfortunate act of nature." "That's not for me to say." She folded her hands on top of the counter. Hannah breathed a silent sigh of relief. "May I inquire if the items my sister placed for sale in your store have been purchased?" "I'm afraid I am under strict instructions from my husband not to do business with you," the storekeeper's wife said, with enough zeal to turn Hannah's cheeks a darker pink. "As I'm sure you are aware, my friends and I lost our possessions in the tornado. We will need the money owed to my sister so we can secure transport back to Walton Valley. Hannah hated the note of desperation that crept into her voice. Good day, Miss Fairchild. Didn't you hear what I said? Hannah asked. We are stuck here without transportation. I must have the money owed to my sister. As your sister is a respectfully married woman, I would be happy to serve her. But she's not here, Hannah said, all attempts at calm conversation abandoned. And I can't tell her to come here because I can't get home. She blinked to clear the tears from her eyes. Where was the woman's compassion? That is not my concern. Now please leave my store. Her eyes raked over Hannah. I'm sure there are opportunities for women of your kind to earn money over on the east side of town. Hannah wasn't so innocent that she didn't know what sort of places were in that part of Council Grove. Humiliation caused the good food Nancy Garfield had served to roll in her stomach. It had been many weeks since Hannah had lost a meal because of feeling unwell, but it was certainly going to happen once more. She hurried out of the store and into the narrow alley between that building and another, where she heaved until her stomach was empty once more. Leaning against the wooden frame structure, she breathed in deeply through her nose and out through her mouth until the nausea passed. What did she have to do to escape the mortification of her past and live a blame-free life? Luke awoke to the sound of voices mumbling in the hallway outside his room. He didn't know how long he had slept, but the light streaming in through the small window to the left of his bed told him it was still daytime. He struggled to sit upright and was thankful that the movement didn't cause him pain. Just as the doctor predicted, he was getting better. Swinging his legs around, he sat cautiously on the side of the bed. So far, so good. Everyone agrees, a voice he didn't recognize said stridently. They must be wed. The members of the town council are not everyone. They are everyone who counts, and their decision was unanimous. Luke dropped his head into his hands. He wanted to follow Harry's plan and become Hannah's friend, to show her he cared for her. Being forced into a marriage with him would make her resentful. He'd fallen asleep thinking about babies with her blonde hair. She would sing lullabies to them in her sweet voice, and maybe, if he was lucky, she might one day allow him to court her. Luke wished he'd never entertained such a ridiculous notion. He had a long way to go to atone for the sins of his past. Never mind the fact a man with his low background wasn't fit company for a lady like Hannah. Whatever had he been thinking? Ah, you're awake. The doctor cleared his throat. This is Peter Cameron, our mayor. Luke pushed himself up from the bed. His legs trembled to support his weight, but he didn't sit back down. Yes, I remember. The mayor did not offer his hand. Preacher, I won't beat around the bush. Last evening, under what I understand were very unusual circumstances, you spent the night with a young woman. Is that correct? We sheltered from a storm, Luke clarified, and by the grace of God, our lives were spared. You live with this young woman in a community along the Santa Fe Trail. Miss Fairchild lives in Walton Valley with her sister. I have recently staked a claim in the same area. And she is in a delicate condition? She is. Luke wanted to say more. He wished he could tell the officious mayor that Hannah's situation was not as it may seem at first glance, but he could not. It was not his story to tell. Is the child yours? Luke bristled, then fought to keep control of his temper. That wouldn't help anyone. It is not. Hannah is not a woman of low moral conduct. Do you see yourself as a man of honor? Of course. Luke's answer was immediate. If he'd been asked the same question a year ago, he would have struggled to give an answer. 2 years ago, his answer would have been as quick, but it would have been in the negative. Will you marry the girl? Luke had expected the question. It's clear her reputation is already ruined, but after last night the stain on it has doubled. No one in town will serve her in their establishments. But if I marry her this afternoon, they will welcome her all over town tomorrow. The mayor had the grace to look embarrassed. I don't make the rules. What rules? Luke asked in a low voice. The ones of propriety. Peter Cameron stumbled over his words as he looked at Luke's face. It is what our town council has decreed should happen. Luke took a step backward and sat in the chair next to his bed. His body was shaking, not with the effort of keeping himself upright, but with the injustice of the mayor's words. "And if I refuse?" "Are you refusing?" The mayor smiled. But rather than it making his demeanor more pleasant, it gave him a sly look that reminded Luke of a snake. "No one would blame you if you did." "Who would want to marry a woman of her kind?" "What kind is that?" The mayor laughed. "Well, obviously one of loose morals. Those types of women are all right for fun, but they're not for marrying, are they?" "I would be proud to marry a woman like Hannah," Luke said softly. "She is brave and strong. Not only is she beautiful, but she is kind and hard-working. And, to be clear, Mayor Cameron, you and your other council members may take your fun on the east side of town, but Hannah has never been near such an establishment." Peter Cameron looked down at his nails as though bored by Luke's speech. "If you say so." "I do say so." Luke got back to his feet and walked over to the other man. "And if I hear you, or anyone else, sullying Miss Fairchild's character around town, I will hand myself in to the sheriff, because I will punch every man who speaks ill of her." "You would defend the honor of a woman such as that?" "Did you not hear what I said?" Luke moved closer. "Do I need to show you how serious I am?" The mayor backed away, holding his hands out in front of his body. "You do not. Strange sort of preacher, aren't you?" "I believe God may alone judge. It certainly should not be the purvey of a council of men who themselves are not free from sin." Luke stared at the mayor until he squirmed. "However, I believe strongly that if a man cannot speak respectfully to a lady, then sometimes he should expect a well-aimed punch to the nose." "Which will not happen in my medical office, gentlemen." "Of course not," Luke agreed. "Just to be clear," the mayor said, from his position near the front door. "You are marrying the girl, then?" "As I have said, it would be my absolute privilege to marry Miss Fairchild, if she will have me." The door clicked closed as the mayor left the doctor's office. Odious man. "Yes." Luke grimaced. "I apologize if my behavior was out of line, especially here in your place of business. I would do the same in your position if someone were speaking ill of my wife." Dr. Garfield rubbed the back of his neck. "Speaking of which, I have a confession to make, and then Nancy has an apology to make." He marched to the other door in the reception area of his office and yanked it open. His wife almost fell through the doorway, followed closely by Hannah. Luke forgot the doctor's words as soon as he saw Hannah. Her eyes were red, as was the tip of her nose. "What happened?" "I am afraid my wife spoke with some of her friends after you arrived this morning," the doctor explained. "She confirmed that you and Miss Fairchild had spent the night together at the old Warren place." "I confirmed what they had already guessed." "Nancy," the doctor said sharply, "I apologize for the distress I have caused." The woman looked contrite. "I didn't know what trouble it would cause. Neither was I aware of Miss Fairchild's unfortunate experience." "Let this be a lesson to you and your ever-wagging tongue," Dr. Garfield said. "Just look at the misery you have caused this poor child. As if she has not suffered enough." "I didn't mean any harm." Nancy looked to Hannah. "Miss Fairchild has been gracious enough to forgive me. When I learned of her ordeal, I was heartsick to have caused her more pain." "Thank you for what you said," Hannah said, her pale blue eyes large in her pale face. "You were very kind." "I meant every word." He held her gaze steadily. Nancy clapped her hands together. "How exciting. We must prepare for a wedding immediately." "Immediately?" Hannah whispered. "I can't get married without my sister." She agreed to marry him. Luke could scarcely believe his ears. "You can't leave until you're married," Nancy pointed out. "Perhaps you can have a celebration with your sister and your friends when you return to Walton Valley. I'm sure that, in the circumstances, your sister will understand." "What have I missed?" he asked wearily. "The storekeeper refused to serve me earlier," Hannah told him. "So we have no money from the sale of the items Eliza made, and therefore no way of hiring replacement transport to take us home." "I'm known in Council Grove," he said. "I'm certain someone would allow me to settle the bill next time I am in town." "Have you changed your mind?" The hurt in Hannah's voice caused him more pain than the wound to his head. "I have not," he said. "I'm just pointing out that we have other options. I don't understand why you would marry me. You don't seem to even like me. The entire town is against us. At least the part of town that controls whether or not we can leave. I can't stay here." Her eyes begged him to understand. And he did. Hannah didn't want to stay in town, where she would always feel judged because of her past. In Walton Valley, they shielded her from that. And of course, it was where her family lived. Luke walked over to where Hannah stood with Mrs. Garfield and slowly lowered himself onto one knee. "Hannah Fairchild, I am happy to repeat all the things I said to the mayor, but I believe you heard every word. I want you to know that I meant them. For the avoidance of any doubt, I will be honored to raise your children as my own." Hannah put a hand over her mouth as fresh tears spilled onto her cheeks. Nancy Garfield blew noisily into a handkerchief. "I will be grateful for the rest of my life." "Is that a yes?" "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I will marry you." Luke didn't want her gratitude. He wanted her love. He was determined to spend the rest of his life, if that's how long it took him, to earn it. Chapter 7. Why had she said yes? It wasn't just the words he'd spoken while she was standing with her ear pressed to the door with Mrs. Garfield, or the ones he'd spoken directly to her after the mayor had left. There was something in his eyes that spoke of his pain and loss. Hannah wished she could fix the part of him that was broken, not because she cared about him, but because she owed him, because of course she didn't care about him. He was still the annoying preacher who had deliberately bought the land next door to her sister's property. She hadn't trusted him then, and although he'd proven his worth as a man over the last 24 hours, she still knew nothing about him. Thomas had promised Eliza they could have the marriage annulled when they reached Santa Fe, and the reason for their marriage of convenience was no longer required. She didn't know what was entailed in an annulment, but surely that would be something Luke would agree to. If only it wasn't such a difficult question to ask. Dr. Garfield had insisted they must wait until the next day to get married and set off on their journey back home. He had ordered Luke back to bed, and she had not seen him since. She had shared an evening meal with the doctor and his wife. The next morning, after a hearty breakfast, Nancy had taken Hannah into her bedroom and brought out a beautiful ivory gown from an enormous wooden chest which stood against the wall. "Now," the woman said, "it may be a little snug around the middle. I was much slimmer in those days." "This is your wedding dress?" Nancy stared at the gown wistfully. "Yes. John and I had such hopes for our future. He would work as a doctor, and I would raise our children. He thought it would be nice to have a son who would eventually work alongside him. I would have a little girl to help me in the kitchen." "What happened?" "There were no babies. Lots of pregnancies, but never a baby. Eventually we stopped trying. The hope each time was too much to bear." "Oh, Mrs. Garfield, I'm so terribly sorry. I'm afraid that the experience has sometimes turned me into a bitter old lady, with nothing to do with my time than gossip about other people's misfortunes. I told you we were never to discuss that incident again. As far as I am concerned, it is forgotten. You and your husband have been exceedingly kind to me." Hannah lifted the hem of the dress. "This really is stunning. Let's get you out of this dress and you can try it on." Nancy had hand-washed Hannah's dress the previous evening, and although it was now clean, it was a serviceable dress suitable for traveling and hard work. It wasn't the sort of gown a girl dreamed of getting married in. She didn't think she could have found a more perfect creation than Mrs. Garfield's if she had searched the entire country. A knock on the door sounded just as Mrs. Garfield slipped the dress over Hannah's head. "Who's there?" she called. "It's John," her husband replied. "I have someone here who would like to see Hannah." "If it's that preacher, tell him he can wait until the service. He cannot see her before." "It's me, Hannah girl." "Stand still and stop fidgeting," Nancy ordered as she began fastening the buttons at the back of the gown. "I'll speak to you in a moment. Mrs. Garfield is lending me the most exquisite dress for my wedding." Hannah waited until she felt Nancy fasten the last button at the nape of her neck. Looking down at herself, she could barely believe that she was wearing a dress of genuine quality once again. She had missed her pretty things after the death of her parents. Her aunt sold the best of the sisters' clothes in her dress shop, leaving them only the plainest dresses for everyday wear. She walked over to the door and opened it cautiously. Where is Luke? In his room, Harry said. My, what a pretty picture you make. Hannah reached over and kissed his cheek. Thank you, Harry. I have a favor I need to ask of you. Anything. Will you please give me away? Harry drew out a grubby-looking handkerchief and made a big show of covering his face while he blew his nose. He wasn't fooling her. Do you have dust in your eyes? Something like that. He reached out awkwardly and patted her arm. It would delight me to stand with you. The preacher is a lucky fella. You look like a real princess. Did you find any of our things? Harry looked behind him. I think I hear Luke coming. Quick, get back inside and I'll see you when you're ready. Hannah frowned, but her attention was soon taken from their missing wagon, horse, and goods by Nancy Garfield, who sat Hannah in front of a looking-glass and began brushing her hair. Who made this dress? My mother, the doctor's wife replied. And she taught me a thing or two about dressing hair too. You just wait until I have you ready. Mr. Johnson will faint at the altar when he sees you walking toward him. Hannah gulped. She was really going to do this. There was no doubt he would look after her. He had shown that when he defended her honor to the mayor. She smiled as she remembered him even threatening to bop the infuriating man on the nose. Would he really have done such a thing? How did that sit with his vocation as a preacher? He hadn't really seemed the type of man to lose his temper, but she didn't really know anything about him. She supposed they had the rest of their lives to get to know each other, unless they got the marriage annulled. Perhaps Luke wouldn't want a wife and someone else's babies when he realized it would only be a marriage in name only. They really should have discussed that aspect of their agreement. Surely that would be obvious to Luke, given her past. Hannah certainly hoped so. Otherwise, theirs could be the shortest marriage in history. Luke pulled at the borrowed tie around his neck and then looked toward the open church door for what felt like the 10th time in the last minute. Relax, Dr. Garfield said, putting a hand on Luke's arm. That's easy for you to say, he retorted. You're not about to marry the most beautiful girl in the world. The one who also hates me, doesn't trust the God I seek to serve, and is going to have not one but 2 babies before Christmas. First, you're right. This is not happening to me, but once upon a time, it did. Once I was standing right where you're standing now, marrying my own beautiful bride. I barely knew Nancy back then, but I knew she was the one for me. How did you meet her? She was traveling through with her family. I convinced her to stay and marry me instead. How long had you known her when you married? The doctor grinned. Her family arrived and camped just outside of town on a Friday evening. We were married before dawn on the Monday morning before the wagon train moved back out on the trail. Have you ever regretted your decision? Not once, John Garfield replied instantly. We've endured hard times, and we've enjoyed the best of times. God has put the 2 of you here in Council Grove together for a reason, just as he did for me and Nancy. Who are we to put up barriers and reasons suggesting he doesn't know what he's doing? Luke's heart hammered with a painful intensity. Do you really believe that? Don't you? I want to, but I'm frightened. Luke spoke the words in his heart. Now didn't seem the time for false bravado. That is perfectly normal, John said. I was afraid I was going to disgrace myself and throw up on my shoes while I waited for Nancy to arrive. Once I saw her, I relaxed, because I knew she was choosing me above anything or anyone else. That's not really the case for us, though. No, it isn't, but she's still marrying you. Only so we can get home. You can tell yourself that if you want, young man, but let's spend a moment examining the facts. Is marrying you really the only way to get home? Yes. The mayor said no one in town will serve us. With no transport, we can't leave. You don't think Bill at the livery would give Harry something he could use for the amount of times he's been through town on the trail? What about Nancy and me? Have either you or Hannah asked if we would be willing to lend you money or have a horse and cart you can borrow? Would you have done that for us? You've both stayed in our home, and we have not expected nor asked for any form of payment. Neither have you approached the church for help. Luke shook his head in complete disbelief. We just accepted what the mayor said we must do. You did. What do you think that means? I just don't know. I do. John nodded to the door as the sound of approaching footsteps sounded outside the small church. It means that young lady out there isn't quite as resistant to your charms as you think she is. She isn't. She certainly has done an excellent job of pretending she doesn't like me at all. You know when you really want something? The doctor leaned forward and whispered into Luke's ear. When it's the thing you want more than anything else. We humans tell ourselves we don't deserve it, or we'll never achieve it. So then when we don't get it, it doesn't hurt as much. We protect our feelings. You sure about this? Harry's voice floated on the air along with the dust motes as the sun shone through the windows. You can always change your mind and marry me instead. The sound of Hannah's delighted laugh lightened Luke's heart, and the dread in his stomach turned to nervous excitement. Dr. Garfield smiled at Luke and nodded. You'll be fine, boy. Luke craned his neck to catch sight of his bride for the first time on their wedding day. When she came into view, his breath hitched, and he coughed to clear his throat. The ivory dress was form-fitting at the top, then gathered above her baby bump so it flowed around her fuller figure and trailed behind her as she walked down the aisle on Harry's arm. Her hair was gathered on top of her head with loose tendrils framing her face. He wanted to pinch himself, unable to believe that this lovely girl was going to marry him. Luke swallowed down the guilt at not taking the time to tell her more about himself before the wedding. There were several things he should have told her, so she had a full picture of the man she had agreed to marry. Except he wasn't that man anymore. He was working hard to become a better man, and that had to be the most important thing. Luke had fully rejected who he used to be and embraced this new him, the preacher, the man who put God first and not his selfish worldly wants, the man who had become who he was despite his rough beginnings. As she drew level with him, Hannah smiled at Luke, and his heart performed an intricate, acrobatic move. Harry took her hand and put it into Luke's. He had to ask, "Are you sure?" She nodded. "Are you?" "Yes." "Shall we begin?" The preacher, whom Luke knew well, asked. Luke tightened his grip on Hannah's hand, and the ceremony began. The service was functional rather than fancy, and was over quickly. Hannah spoke her vows quietly but clearly, and just like that, they were married. He joined both of their hands together, then leaned forward and kissed Hannah's pink cheek. She was his to keep safe, and there was nothing he wouldn't do to make sure of that. He had let Silas down, but that wouldn't happen again. Nothing and no one would make him be that man again. With those words crashing into each other in his head, Luke strode confidently down the aisle with Hannah on his arm. They emerged into the summer sunshine, and he blinked to clear his vision. It couldn't be, and yet it was. Leaning against the building opposite the church was his past. Dressed in black, with a hat low over his eyes, stood the one man Luke had hoped never to see again in his life. Their trip back to Council Grove was fortunately not as eventful as their journey to the small town where Hannah had become a married woman. She hugged her arms around her body. She still found it so difficult to believe, though she had barely had a day to get used to the fact. They had left immediately after the ceremony, as Luke was keen to get home before the sun set. Nancy had given them a basket of food for their midday meal, and Hannah promised to write to her new friend with news. Harry disappeared as they were saying their goodbyes, only to reappear with a horse and a small cart. "Isn't that your horse, Luke?" "Funny story about that," Harry explained. "No one had seen the beast, but after I collected Eliza's money from the store and went to the livery, there he was. It's a miracle." "Praise God," Luke muttered as he stared at Harry in disbelief. "What?" Harry shrugged. "Ain't you always saying that he moves in mysterious ways?" Luke had said nothing about going back into the church and telling the preacher the reason for their wedding no longer existed. Nancy had counseled Hannah to give the preacher a chance, and certainly he seemed keen to leave Council Grove and get back home while he was still a married man. As they approached their settlement, Hannah finally allowed herself to relax. Her back ached from holding herself stiffly on the rickety old cart Bill had lent to Harry. She turned to Luke. "We're home." "You haven't even got a home," Harry cackled from the back. "Where are you going to sleep tonight? Under the stars?" I guess Hannah will stay with her sister, and I will stay with Josh and Noah until we can finish my house. Please tell me you remembered the nails?" Harry patted his pocket. "Of course I did. My head wasn't full of thoughts of a girl, so I remembered what we needed." "Who was your head full of last time you were in Council Grove?" Hannah teased as she nudged her new husband with her elbow. To her delight, color flooded into Luke's face. "I don't know what Harry's talking about." "So keen to get home and build his house right next door to you, Hannah girl. He forgot to buy nails." "Thank you, Harry." Luke turned, and Mock glared at the older man. "Look," Hannah called excitedly. "Everyone is coming out to meet us." It seemed to take forever for the wheels on the small cart to bring them the final few yards to Walton Valley. Lucky danced around her friends and family, getting in the way and thumping his massive tail into the dirt ground. Finally, Luke pulled the brake and moved around to lift her down. Eliza rushed forward and pulled her sister into a fierce hug. "Where have you been? We were expecting you back days ago." "We were caught in a tornado," Hannah explained, looking around the small settlement that was so dear to her. "You didn't see it?" "There was a small storm the evening you left, but it was over almost as soon as it started." "Goodness, when you say caught in a tornado, what do you mean?" "Luke was hurt by falling debris." Hannah smiled at her new husband. "He saved my life." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Did he really? How gallant." "He pushed me to the floor in an old shack and then covered me so I would not be hurt. You should feel the bump on the back of his head." "Poor Luke." Harry bumped into Luke. "He saved the day in more ways than one. Tell him the rest of it, preacher." Luke turned to Hannah and picked up her left hand. Her lips trembled as she smiled at her sister. The inhabitants of Council Grove were not happy we had to spend the night in the old cabin alone. "Where were you, Daddy?" George asked, suspicion in her gaze as she glanced at her father, blown away by the tornado. Harry held out his hands helplessly. "When I made my way back to the shack, it seemed both Hannah and Luke were knocked out. I walked all the way into Council Grove to raise the alarm." "You walked all that way?" Eli asked, just as dubious as his wife. "Where was Luke's horse?" "Lost the horse and the wagon, and all of your goods, I'm afraid, Eliza." She waved a hand dismissively. "You're all safe. That is the main thing." "But isn't that Luke's horse?" Josh pointed at the animal harnessed to the cart. "He arrived back into town just as we were leaving," Hannah repeated Harry's story. "Isn't that miraculous?" "It certainly is." Grace stepped forward and embraced Hannah. "You poor things. You don't look any worse for your ordeal. The lovely people of Council Grove must have taken good care of you all." Luke cleared his throat and waited until the murmur of voices died down. "As I said, they were not happy about us spending the night together and insisted that we were married." "That's rather excessive in the circumstances." Thomas looked at Hannah. "They must have understood that being caught in a tornado was not your fault?" "Some of them did, but the town council insisted we were married. Otherwise, the shopkeepers would not serve us." Eliza put a hand over her mouth. "Are you telling us that the two of you are married?" Luke gripped her hand a little tighter, and she was grateful for his unwavering support. "Yes, we were married this morning." "Well," Eliza began as she looked at Hannah. "Well, that's a lot to take in. How do you feel?" "Rather overwhelmed," Hannah replied honestly. "We should probably go inside and talk," Thomas suggested. "I'd like to talk to Hannah by myself first," Eliza said. "Perhaps we can go for a walk down by the creek," Thomas said to Luke in a voice quite unlike his own. "Brother?" Luke squeezed her hand again, then leaned down and placed a sweet kiss near her ear. "I'll see you soon." Hannah accepted a hug and congratulations from the rest of her friends before following her sister into her house. She wondered what Thomas would say to Luke, but mostly she wondered who that strange man was outside the church. His piercing glare made her shiver as she remembered its malice. A few people had gathered early that morning as they left the church, but they were all smiling. The man in black was not. His face was set into a grim line as he had stared directly at Luke. Who was he and what did he want with her new husband? Chapter 8. Luke carried two of the plain wooden chairs from Thomas and Eliza's cabin down to the creek, where Hannah waited for him. It was 2 weeks since she had said, "I do," and he thanked God every day for the gift of his wife. He had taken Eliza's place in the fields, while the two women had worked hard to replace the goods that had been lost in the tornado. When Eliza and Thomas left for Independence, they would leave the curtains and dresses at the store in Council Grove. It seemed more sensible that they concentrate on the community's crops. Luke and Hannah would live together in Eliza and Thomas's cabin while they were away. "How is that?" he asked as they sat down. Hannah lifted her dress clear of the water and dipped her feet into the slowly moving stream. "Luke, what a wonderful idea. This is heavenly." He beamed, as he did every time he did something that met with Hannah's approval. He didn't think he would ever tire of her praise. Luke had placed the chairs in the middle of the creek, and the cool water soon had them both forgetting how hot the day had been. "I'm just glad the creek is still running," he commented. "Every morning I wake up and expect it to have dried up." "Harry seems positive that won't happen. He says the creek was the main reason he settled here. Eli is just as clear that Harry settled here because this is right where he had his accident." Luke laughed. He wanted to point out that perhaps God knew this was exactly where this group of people needed to be at this particular time, but he refrained. He had taken Harry's advice to heart and was doing his best to encourage his wife to fall in love with him, Luke Johnson. He prayed her faith in God would follow. "How long do you think Eliza and Thomas will be gone?" The smile slid from Hannah's face. "They could be gone as long as 3 months. It depends on how long it takes for Thomas's family to arrive in Independence. The journey from Ireland can take longer depending on the conditions. Then they have to travel from New York." "Thomas expects the trial to be over quickly," Luke said, as casually as he could. "There's plenty of evidence against our uncle." Hannah swung her legs back and forth. "They're certain he will be found guilty. The judge will decide how long he should spend in prison." Luke bit back the words that came naturally to him. Philip Fairchild would receive his most serious judgment when he arrived before God. "I hope his imprisonment will give you a measure of peace." "Holding on to hate is not helping me," she admitted. "I know you will tell me that Jesus taught forgiveness, but I'm afraid I'm a long way from that." "I can understand that. Have you forgiven God for allowing Silas to die? That was your friend's name, wasn't it?" Luke swallowed. Although he wanted to bring Hannah closer to God, he didn't want to use his own experiences to do it. He didn't know how to speak about Silas without revealing his part in his friend's death. "Yes, that was his name." Hannah raised an eyebrow at the brevity of his response. "You've forgiven God." "God didn't allow Silas to die." Luke forced himself to meet Hannah's gaze. "Silas was killed. God isn't responsible for the things that man chooses to do. Men and women are all born with choices." "Someone chose to kill Silas? But why?" Luke ignored the second question. "Yes, Silas was shot dead." Hannah considered his words for a moment. "I'm terribly sorry about your friend, but I'm glad that your life was spared." He couldn't tell her his life wasn't under threat because he wasn't with his friend when he was killed, but it was almost certainly him that was the target of the outlaw's bullet. Luke changed the direction of their conversation. "I know you're angry with God, and I can understand why. I hope one day you will stop being angry and see that what happened to you was because of your uncle's actions and not God's inaction. I want to reach a place where I have some acceptance of what happened, but I'm not there yet. But I'm trying, Luke. I really am." He loved the way she said his name, nearly as much as he admired how brave she was, even though that only reminded him of what a complete coward he was. He deliberately turned the conversation back onto her so he didn't have to talk about Silas, or admit his part in his friend's death. What did that say about him as a man? "I'm very proud of you," he told her honestly. "I hope you know how incredibly fond of you I am." Hannah's cheeks colored, and she looked down at her feet. "Luke. What?" he laughed. "A man can't compliment his wife and tell her how he feels? I don't know what to say when you say things like that." "You might tell me you're fond of me too," he suggested. "Are you fond of me, Hannah?" Luke stopped breathing while he waited for her response. Anything was better than the outright hate she had for him when they first met. "I like you very much." He'd take that. He focused on the positives in her words and not on what she hadn't said. They had the rest of their lives for her feelings to grow. Luke just hoped that if one day his wife came to love him, he had grown enough as a man to deserve the depth of her affection. She more than liked him. Hannah could admit to herself that she was falling in love with her husband, but she wasn't ready to tell Luke that. Not when she didn't really know him. How could she love a man who was keeping secrets from her? Who was that man staring at you opposite the church? He glanced at her sharply before looking up the slight incline toward Eliza's house, as though wishing someone would come and rescue him from her questions. I don't know who you mean. He wore dark clothes and had a hat pulled down low over his eyes, she pressed. I didn't like the way he was looking at you. Most likely someone who was jealous because I had just married the most beautiful girl in the whole of the country. He grinned at her. As a woman who was nearly 6 months pregnant with twins, she would take every compliment she could get. But she preferred sincere ones, not words spoken to distract her from her questions. You must know the man I mean, she went on, then changed tack. He frightened me. I'm sorry you were scared. He met her eyes briefly. But I still don't remember seeing such a man. It was very sunny when we came out of the church. I remember blinking to clear my vision. Yes, Hannah agreed. I did the exact same thing. That's when I saw that man. I won't let anything happen to you, Hannah. You trust me, don't you? He had altered the thrust of their conversation again. Of course I trust you. She did trust that he would do his best to keep her safe, but she couldn't have complete confidence in him because he wasn't answering her questions to her satisfaction. Have you thought about names for the babies yet? I thought perhaps we could choose names together, she said shyly. Every time she spoke to him about anything even slightly personal, she got nervous and tongue-tied, terrified she would say the wrong thing and the light in his eyes when he looked at her would vanish. If you would like that, I would feel very honored to be involved. The babies will have your name, Hannah pointed out. It seems only fair that you have a say in their names. What do you like? My mother was called Charlotte. If one baby is a girl, I think I would like to choose that name. What was your mother called? Luke's lips twitched as though he were going to say something, and then changed his mind. Scarlet. That's a very unusual name, she remarked. I believe I've only heard of it as a color rather than a name. My mother was a very unusual woman. Luke's mouth twisted again. Tell me more about her. My mother and I were not close. But she's your mother, Hannah protested. You were blessed with loving, godly parents, Luke spoke quickly. I was not. What was your father's name? Do you remember singing to me in Dr. Garfield's office? There was that abrupt change in conversation again. Hannah ticked off Luke's parents as other subjects he didn't want to discuss, as well as his friend Silas. Yes, you sang to me and stroked my hair. His voice was low, and he stared at her so intently. Goosebumps raised along her arms. No one had ever comforted me in such a way before. You said your mother wasn't the singing kind, Hannah said cautiously. Was she not affectionate either? Not with me. Whatever did that mean? Hannah looked at Luke, but his expression was guarded. She couldn't even begin to guess what he was thinking. At times like this, when he was asked questions he didn't want to answer, he looked like someone else. A person she couldn't reach, not the kind and happy man that she married. I'm sorry. Luke stood and walked over to her. He bent his knees so he was at the same height as her and picked up her hands. Why are you sorry, my love? She raised her chin to look directly at him. I am sorry for the little boy that you were. I hate that you weren't lucky enough to experience the love of your parents. He swallowed, but didn't look away from her. I promise our children will never doubt my love for them. Thank you, she said, humbly, wishing she had something more eloquent to say. Hannah, can I ask you something? Yes, she whispered, her heart hammering wildly at the intenseness of his gaze. Can I kiss you? She nodded, unable to utter a word as emotion clogged her throat. Luke slowly bent his head closer to hers. Until this point, he had only kissed her cheek, and occasionally her hand. This time, he was going to touch his lips against hers. Hannah lifted her mouth to meet his. With infinite care, he brushed his lips against hers for the briefest of seconds before resting his forehead against hers. The connection was fleeting, but nice enough that she knew she wanted to feel it again. She wasn't brave enough to ask him for another kiss, so she settled for holding onto his hands extra tightly as her heart stopped slamming around her chest and calmed to a normal rhythm. Was this how it felt for all wives when they were close to their husband? Or was she especially lucky? The sweet feeling that flooded through her made her want to sing and smile at everything and everyone. She wasn't ready to offer him her whole heart, but as each day passed, her affection for him grew and he owned a bit more. Luke wrapped an arm around Hannah's shoulders, wishing he could absorb her pain through his touch as she cried quietly. The dust from his horse's hooves had settled, but Hannah still stared after her sister and Thomas. He would not suggest they move and get on with their day. He was content to stand there for as long as it took. His stomach churned every time he thought about the gift Eliza had left for Hannah and her reaction when she saw it. The present was his idea, something he wanted to do for his wife, but he needed Eliza's help with it. Eventually, as the sun rose higher in the sky, Hannah looked up at him. "I should go over to Grace's and help with the midday meal. I have something for you to see before you go." She looked wary. "Something I haven't already seen?" "Luke Johnson, you shouldn't distract your wife from her work." He grinned back at her. "It will distract you, but only for moments. I'm certain Grace won't mind." Luke held out a hand for her and she took his hand and walked with him into Eliza's home. He led her toward the bedroom. "What is it?" "Close your eyes," he whispered into her ear. He peered down at her. "You're peeking. Shut them properly, Hannah." He waited until she did as he asked. "Now walk forward. That's right, a few more steps. Stop there. Open your eyes." She blinked, looked up at him, then back at the dress Eliza had left laid on the bed. "Is this for me?" "Of course it's for you. Do you know any other beautiful new brides who deserve a new dress from their husband?" Luke held his breath, waiting for her reaction. It was worth the wait. Hannah threw her arms around him and pulled him as close as her baby bump would allow. "It's the exact color I would have chosen for a dress. However, did you know?" He let out the breath he was holding. "Nancy chose the material. I asked her to go to the store and pick out something that would bring out the blue in your eyes." Hannah shook her head in wonder. "How did Eliza stitch this dress without me seeing?" Luke smiled ruefully. "You recall all those nights your sister and her husband have had under the ruse of allowing us some privacy. The cabin was a simple 2-room structure with one main room and one bedroom. When Eliza and Thomas retired for the night, Luke and Hannah had spent time together before he went back to stay with Josh and Noah. "You are both very sneaky," Hannah said. "But I'm so grateful, thank you. It's very thoughtful of you. Do you need help to try it on, or should I wait in the other room?" "I couldn't possibly wear it now." Luke struggled to keep his face neutral. "You don't like it?" "It's perfect," she reassured him. "But too fine for everyday wear, but just right for Sunday best." He wanted to see her in the pale pink gown with its cream piping. On the day they had married, her face had shone with a mixture of excitement, wariness, and an adorable shyness. She had loved wearing such a fine dress, and he wanted to see her that happy every single day. He crossed his fingers behind his back for luck. "Pretend today is Sunday." "I have to work, Luke. I don't want to ruin it." She might talk sense, but the longing in her glance when she looked at the dress told him she could be convinced. "Tonight," he proposed, "after we have eaten dinner, I would like to take a walk with you down to the creek. Will you wear the dress then?" "Would it make you happy?" she whispered shyly as she ran a hand over the soft material. "Seeing you happy makes me happy." The softness in her gaze melted the excuses he had given himself as to why he wasn't the right man for Hannah. Right then, he felt 10 feet tall. He had dodged the questions about his family, Silas, and the man outside the church in Council Grove. Without those 3 problems, his wife was falling in love with him. Hannah rested a hand on his arm and reached up to press a kiss against his cheek. "You are a very special man." He wanted so desperately for her words to be true, for him to shed completely the man he had been, and only be the one standing before her right now. Slowly, giving her plenty of time to back away from him if she didn't welcome his touch, he placed his hands on her face. Then he pressed his lips against hers. He meant it to be the softest of kisses before he backed away, but Hannah looped her arms around his neck. Luke savored those few seconds before his sweet wife dropped her arms to her side and stepped backwards. Her face was flushed and her eyes bright. Now would be a good time to tell her the words that were slapping against each other on his tongue in their eagerness to be heard. I love you. But he couldn't say them. It wasn't fair to say them while he wasn't being honest. Yet telling her the truth would surely be the way to lose her respect and watch the admiration in her eyes fade. He didn't think he could bear to see her look at him with disdain again. The two competing options vied for supremacy, and he gulped down his fear of losing her. He couldn't lose her. I love you, Hannah. Chapter 9. His words repeated in her mind for the rest of the day. She peeled vegetables with grace, and her stomach dipped, eliciting an almost nervous feeling every time she recalled Luke's words. Later, she took Beth for a walk, and when she caught sight of Luke working in the fields far off in the distance, his words came back to her with clarity. What has made you so happy today? George asked when Hannah returned to her cabin with Beth. Or should I say who? Hannah giggled nervously, actually giggled, like she was a schoolgirl again. Luke and I are so happy together. Isn't the first few weeks of marriage just the best? I'm finding that is so, yes. Hannah handed the baby back to her mother. Though you and Eli seem incredibly happy too. George smiled. We are, but no marriage is always happy. Why, you should have seen me toward the end of my pregnancy with Beth. Everything that Eli did annoyed me. I can't imagine that, Hannah shook her head in wonder. You should ask him about it sometime. He couldn't do a single thing right, and it terrified him I didn't love him anymore. The poor man. Hannah smiled as she remembered the thoughtful gift Luke had arranged with Eliza for her. Luke purchased material in Council Grove and asked Eliza to make a dress for me. George chuckled. Oh, I know all about that. You do? Of course, it's almost impossible to keep a secret in Walton Valley. I knew within 5 minutes of you returning. My father told me. That reminds me, Hannah said. I need to speak to your papa. Uh-oh, George pulled a face. What has he done this time? He told us that Luke's horse was missing. We believed the only way we could get home was to marry so the shopkeepers would serve us. Then directly after the wedding, if you can believe it, the horse turns up at the livery. You're right, George said carefully. That seems very coincidental. Do you think your father could have engineered us marrying? I wish I could tell you he wouldn't interfere like that. George patted Beth's back as she swayed back and forth. The baby's eyes fluttered closed as her mother rocked her. But I'm afraid there's nothing I wouldn't put past my father. Hannah shrugged, then smiled again as a picture of her handsome husband's face came into her mind. I don't suppose it matters now. Luke is so sweet. The preacher is a very good man. Although, Hannah paused. She didn't want to speak ill of her husband, but the secrets he was keeping from her concerned her. There's very little I know about his past. George tilted her head to one side as she considered Hannah's words. Do you need to know about that? Can you not be content with the man you know now, the one you're married to? They're the same man, though, aren't they? What happened to him when he was younger will have influenced who he is now. For instance, do you remember him talking about his friend Silas who died? George frowned. Vaguely, I don't really recall the conversation. Luke said Silas was killed. Hannah lowered her voice, even though there was no one about who could hear them talking. Someone shot him. How terrible, George murmured. Luke must have been devastated. That's just it, Hannah went on. He seems very upset about it, but when I ask him what happened, he changes the subject. He does the same when I ask about his parents. Perhaps he's just a very private man, George suggested. Maybe he will open up to you more when he's more secure in your relationship. Yes. Hannah was happy to agree to George's suggestion. I'm sure I'm worrying about nothing. She kept her concern about the man outside the church to herself. It sounded silly in her own head. It would sound positively ludicrous if she told George there was a man who stared intensely at Luke back in Council Grove. "Tell me about the dress," George said. "Did you love it?" "Luke has asked me to wear it tonight after dinner." Hannah smiled shyly at her friend. "Of course, how exciting. It'll be your first night together, won't it?" Hannah hadn't really thought about it like that. Of course, she knew the plan was for her and Luke to stay in Eliza's cabin while she and Thomas were away. She just hadn't thought about what that might mean to him and what he might expect. "Yes," Hannah croaked. Perhaps she could stay with Grace instead. Maybe Luke would prefer to stay with Josh and Noah, as he had since their return from Council Grove. Even as she worked through the alternatives, she knew her husband wanted to spend the night with her. After all, wasn't that why he had asked her to wear her new dress? "Oh goodness, you poor darling. Are you nervous?" "We haven't really talked about our marriage," Hannah said, stumbling over her words. "About our individual expectations, that is. We really just rushed into getting married so we could get home." "But you haven't regretted marrying Luke?" Her anxiety evaporated. "No, I haven't. I'll admit he infuriated me when we first met, and I didn't think I even liked him. But he has proven himself to be very sweet. He has said he will love my babies as his own. We have even spoken about what names we might choose." George reached over and patted Hannah's arm. "I think that should tell you all that you need to know about the man that you married. Luke Johnson is a good man. Whatever he was, or whoever he was, before he arrived in Walton Valley just doesn't matter." "I'm very lucky, aren't I?" Hannah hugged her arms around her body as she spoke, then recalled the wonderfully warm feeling that spread throughout her body when Luke kissed her. Even the tips of her toes tingled. She wasn't just lucky, she was blessed. Perhaps it was time for her to accept that he knew exactly what he was doing when he placed Luke in her path. Luke and Hannah walked together after dinner to what would be their home for the next few weeks. He held her hand as they covered the distance between Grace's cabin, where they had eaten, and Eliza's. He waited none too patiently as she went into the bedroom to change. The wait was worth it. Nancy had picked the perfect color to emphasize Hannah's features. The pale pink dress highlighted her fair hair, blue eyes, and creamy complexion. "You are so beautiful." He forced the words out past the lump in his throat. "I am an incredibly lucky man." "You don't deserve her." Luke ignored the mocking voice in his head as he took her hand once more, and they walked down to the creek at the back of Thomas's property. He hoped she wouldn't ask him any more personal questions. He felt remorse every time he avoided answering her queries about Silas and his family, but the fear of losing her was greater than his guilt. When they reached the creek, he threw down a thick quilt he'd brought and helped Hannah to get settled. She had never asked for his help, but he noticed that she sometimes struggled to get up from a seated position without something to hold on to. "I wanted to let you know. How will we?" They both spoke at the same time. Luke smiled awkwardly at her. She was as aware as he was that they needed to have a personal conversation before the time came for them to retire to bed. "You go first," she encouraged softly. "I wanted to let you know I would be more than happy to sleep on the floor in the main room." He held Hannah's hand, his thumb stroking her impossibly soft skin. "I couldn't possibly make you sleep on the floor," she said. "I've been sleeping on the floor in Josh and Noah's cabin for weeks," he replied, with a smile. "And you certainly can't be sleeping on the floor anymore in your delicate condition. I've seen how you struggle to get up from a chair. I hate to think of how you manage in a morning." "It is very difficult," she admitted. "I roll from my side onto my knees, and then use the back of a kitchen chair to get to my feet." He shook his head. "That will not do. I will not have my wife suffering unnecessarily." She smiled at the intensity of his tone. "You are so sweet to me." "You deserve it," he told her earnestly. "I will do anything I can to protect you, especially from myself. I don't want you to sleep on the floor." Hannah pulled a deep breath into her lungs, and Luke could see the effort it was taking her to speak what was on her mind. "We are a married couple, but the personal aspect of our marriage." She ran out of words, her face bright red. Luke lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles. "I'm happy to do this, to hold your hand to kiss your cheek, and for you to be the first thing I see every morning. That is enough for me. More than anything else, I want you to trust me." "I trust you," she said eagerly as her color returned to normal. "I do trust you, Luke." "I love the way you say my name," he told her, "in your perfectly precise English accent." She giggled. "I say your name the way everyone else says it. It's hard to say Luke differently, despite the various accents everyone here in Walton Valley has." "Well, I like the way you say it best." They sat together quietly, watching the sun set over the endless horizon. His mind drifted to his mother, and as usual, the shame of his past threatened to overwhelm him. Usually he read his Bible or said a prayer to remind himself that God loved all of his children exactly the same. It didn't matter whether they were of low birth or the earthly children of nobility. Jesus called people from all walks of life to be his followers, but his disciples were made up mostly of men from ordinary professions. "Why do you look so serious?" A glib answer floated on the edge of his tongue. He was going to tell her he was thinking about how beautiful she looked in her new gown. Except he'd already told her that, and it would be a lie. Luke opened his mouth to tell her the truth about his mother. She had innocently told him she trusted him. Did he not owe her the truth? He couldn't bear to see her reaction or for her to see him in a different light. She thought he was a sweet, caring man, and she was glad he was her husband. "I wanted to ask if you would pray with me." Her eyes widened, as though his words surprised her, as well she might be, because he was just as shocked as she was as they tripped from his mouth. He hadn't planned on saying anything of the sort. "I prayed during the tornado," she admitted. "You did?" "I prayed to God to keep my baby safe." And so he did. Luke lifted a hand to rest it on her belly, then changed his mind. "He blessed you with twins." Hannah caught hold of his hand and brought it down to the swell of her stomach. "You told me these were to be our babies." "They are," he said fiercely. She smiled softly. "Then you must feel as comfortable in touching them and talking to them as I do." She rubbed her belly and was delighted when one baby moved against his hand. "Let us pray." Luke waited until she closed her eyes. He watched her for a few seconds before closing his own eyes. "Our dear Heavenly Father, we thank Thee for leading us to this place filled with good friends and family. We ask for your protection over Eliza and her husband Thomas while they travel. We also ask for your love and protection for our children as they grow. Please bless our harvest that we may have enough food to get us through the winter months. Finally, we ask for your blessing on our community. May it thrive and flourish. Amen." "Amen," she echoed. "You're a coward." Luke ignored the inner voice. He might be a coward, but he was a coward with a beautiful wife who was pregnant with twins. It was his duty to care for her and do his utmost to make sure she had a safe and healthy pregnancy, not burden her with the troubles of his past. A short time later, Hannah could barely keep her eyes open. Luke solicitously helped her to her feet, and they walked together back to Eliza's cabin. She had no reason to doubt Luke's word, and she trusted he would be content to hold her hand that evening and for many more to come. But still, her heart hammered in her chest, as though she were about to do something that couldn't be undone. Luke sat on a chair to pull off his boots, while she went into the bedroom alone to get ready for bed. As they had arranged, she called him when he could come in. She lay under the covers and squeezed her eyes shut as Luke readied himself. She could hear the rustling of clothes as he put on his nightshirt and couldn't help the furious blush that crawled up her neck and settled on her face. It all felt so intimate, and she worried she'd made a terrible mistake. Hannah forced herself to breathe deeply and evenly. She feared her heart was about to jump right out of her chest when she felt Luke sit on the edge of the bed. He reached out a hand and touched her cheek. She flinched. "Hannah?" Mortified, she reluctantly opened her eyes to look into his concerned face. "I'm so sorry, my sweet darling," he murmured. "I don't want you to ever apologize for an honest reaction. You cannot help the way you feel. I can sleep on the floor." She reached for his hand. "I don't want you to sleep in the other room." With infinite care, Luke lifted the quilt and lay down beside her. ensuring the only part of him that touched her was his hand. She clutched it tightly, as though she were on the edge of a mountain, and the only thing stopping her from falling off was Luke. She nearly laughed out loud at the absurdity of their situation. Weeks ago, she had wished she'd never set eyes on the man, and now she couldn't imagine ever being without him. Of course, she could accept, if only to herself, that the reason she had not wanted to be around Luke was because she had known from their very first meeting that he was attracted to her. She had been so afraid of feeling something in return, only to be rejected by him when he realized her condition. Amazingly, her pregnancy had not affected the way he felt about her, and now he looked at her as though she was the most precious thing in the world. She had never imagined as she fled independence that she would experience such joy again in her life. She wished she could stop the nagging doubt in her mind that if she really was good enough to be his wife, then he would share all the aspects of his life with her. Was he holding back because, despite what he told her, he still saw her as flawed? Hannah determined to stop wasting time worrying about things she could not control. She would learn to be grateful for what she had instead of allowing herself to fret about Luke's secrets. She had a lot more than many people, a home, a husband who adored her, and plenty of food to eat. That would be enough for her. She prayed that each day she would let Luke's love for her make her feel a little less ruined, until one day she was whole again. Chapter 10. With every passing day, Luke allowed himself to believe that the man Hannah called the dark stranger would not appear in Walton Valley to take back what he thought belonged to him. He woke up each morning to Hannah's sweet smile and thanked God every night for his wisdom. The simple life he led now was a far cry from the one he had pursued only a few years previously, but it was richer in so many ways. The men of Walton Valley were about to leave for the fields when a cloud of dust in the distance alerted them to someone approaching. Harry peered into the vastness of the prairie. Not a horse, moving too slow, lots of dust. Harry turned to everyone with a gummy smile. It's a wagon train. I wonder if there'll be letters, Noah said with a big grin. Who'd be writing to you? Luke asked, and nudged his friend with an elbow. Didn't even know you could read. Noah tapped his nose. I'm expecting a letter. His brother frowned. I seem to remember you received one last time. We brought a packet of notes with us when we returned. Hannah turned to Luke as she spoke. After we were married. He'd never tire of hearing Hannah speak of their marriage or her shy smile when she looked at him. That's true. I forgot to ask you about those. Who you been writing to, Noah? Grace drew in a breath. Noah, do you have a sweetheart? To Luke's great surprise, Noah blushed to the roots of his fair hair. He looked down at the ground and poked at a root with the toe of his boot. I don't know what you're talking about. Eventually, the large procession of wagons stopped near Grace's cabin, and Harry's old friend Herb jumped down. Can't believe you stopped the entire train to pass the time of day with me. Harry smacked his friend heartily on the back. Needed to stretch my legs, Herb retorted, then looked around at the gathered settlers. Where's your store? After the harvest, Harry said. The boys have work to do. The store will be up by the time you next pass through. I work in the barn every day to make shelves. Herb guffawed. I can't believe my ears. You can't make shelves, Harry Walton. You remember that fine Irish fella? He done teached me how. Bet they collapse first time you use 'em. Harry crossed his arms and eyed his friend. You want to bet? What would you fellas bet? Luke asked. Now, Grace said briskly. Let's not get to gambling. Luke's face heated, and he looked at Hannah. She raised a quizzical eyebrow at him, then looked back to the discussion between the two old friends. They were entertaining, and that was a fact. Now, Mrs. Mitchell, would two fine fellas such as us ever do such a thing? Herb inquired. Yes, she responded without missing a beat. You certainly would. Remember what the Bible says in Timothy. For the love of money is the root of all evil. It was one of the first verses that Luke had memorized. Yes, ma'am, Harry said, his voice as contrite as Luke had ever heard. Say, I've got some letters here for you, Noah. Herb waggled his eyebrows at Noah. Some of these letters smell like fancy perfume. You have got a sweetheart, Grace exclaimed, turning to Noah in surprise. Maybe. Noah caught the letters Herb threw in his direction. I'm going to read one letter in particular before we start work. He hurried off. Eli looked at Josh. Did you know about this? He's always reading or scribbling something on an evening. Luke recalled that about Noah, but had assumed the other man was writing a journal or making notes about the scriptures Luke read out loud. I wonder if the letters are all from the same woman. Different writing, Herb told them helpfully. Return addresses aren't the same either. Herb, Grace admonished. Can't help being observant, he retorted with a nonchalant shrug. How exciting! Hannah moved to stand next to Luke and squeezed his hand. Maybe there will be another wedding in Walton Valley. Maybe Josh will take a shine to one of Thomas's sisters, George suggested. I'm too busy for a wife, Josh said quickly. That's what everyone says. Eli looked at George. Right before they fall in love. I couldn't wait to get to Santa Fe and start a new life, but I didn't even get halfway there. And now look at you. George smiled at her husband fondly, then winked as she added, You've turned yourself into a fairly decent farmer. Everyone in the settlement knew there was nothing Eli couldn't turn his hand to, but his dream was for Walton Valley to grow into a town big enough to support a medical practice. Luke's own vision for his future was to be the regular preacher at a church. Maybe if his aspiration were realized, the shame of his past would fade, and he could be as proud of himself as Hannah was of the man she thought he was. Be seeing ya, old friend. Herb nodded at Harry, gave a cheery wave, and retook his position on the buckboard of the first wagon in the train. Hope your store is open for business next time I pass through. It will be, Harry called. You can count on it. As soon as Herb was out of earshot, Eli turned to his father-in-law. How many shelves do you have built so far? Don't you start, boy, Harry shrugged. It's harder work than it looks. Everyone knew that Harry's favorite pastime was to make little wooden toys. It was easier for him to sit down and make smaller items than to spend a long time standing up. His leg soon gave him a lot of pain if he used it too much. We've chattered enough this morning. Let's get to work. Eli clapped his hands together. Luke paused long enough to kiss Hannah's cheek before joining his friends on their walk toward the fields. It might well be a simple life that he lived these days, but it was one full of joy. Hannah walked inside Grace's cool home. Goodness, it's warm outside already. George nodded. It's going to be blisteringly warm today. I'm glad I'm not out in the fields with no shade. Those poor boys, Grace shook her head. Then, as was her way, she added pragmatically, Still, if we want to eat and feed the animals this winter, the fields have to be tended to and harvested. It was their habit for the three women to work in the cabin until mid-morning, when they would prepare lunch. By that time, the sun had moved in the sky, and the cabin was flooded with sunshine, making it too uncomfortable to stay inside. George settled Beth in her basket on the floor and pulled out her sewing. I wish I was better at this. You're much better than you were, Grace said. If that were true, you might give me something to sew that people would actually see. George smiled self-deprecatingly at Hannah. We each have our own talents. What's mine? George wondered. Hannah is so clever with a needle, as is Eliza. We were trained to make dresses by our aunt, Hannah said. Our talent is more down to the fact we were too afraid of Aunt Helen to sew badly. Grace shook her head. What an awful woman. George reached over and patted Hannah's arm. I'm so glad you're here with us now. I've always been in awe of you, Hannah told her friend. Me? George choked out a laugh. Why ever would you be in awe of me? You and Eliza were raised as proper young ladies in England. Grace is the very epitome of a refined lady, whereas I was raised riding wagon trains my whole life. But there's nothing you can't do, Hannah explained. You can cut wood, haul water without spilling a single drop, and you know everything there is to know about prairie flowers and wild herbs. And you can sew and sing like an angel. As I said, girls, we each have our talents. We should remember to praise God for them, for He is the one. What do we have here? Hannah gasped as a man strode into Grace's cabin. It was him, the man from Council Grove, who had stared at Luke with such hate after their wedding. George moved the basket containing her daughter under the table, but it was too late. The stranger moved over and yanked the basket back into view. The forceful action startled Beth, and she began to cry. "Please," George begged, "please don't hurt my baby." "I ain't got no argument with you, lady," he sneered. "Or your screaming brat." "I know you," Hannah said, her voice sounding far calmer than she felt. "You were outside the church when Luke and I married." He looked pointedly at Hannah's belly. "Bit late getting a ring on your finger, wasn't he?" Hannah lifted her chin and forced herself to relax. "What do you want with us?" "It's your husband I want." Hannah shivered despite the heat. "What business do you have with my husband?" "He owes me." The man's eyes narrowed menacingly. "And I always collect what I'm owed." What could Luke possibly owe you? She sounded brave and in control. But inside, Hannah was quaking. This was everything she had feared when she'd questioned Luke about the strange man. "Who are you, sir?" "Bit high and mighty for a woman who was in the family way before she got wed, ain't ya?" "Who are you?" she repeated. "Jed Felton. Your husband escaped my bullet once. He won't escape this time. You can count on it, lady." Hannah's bravado crumbled. "You killed Silas." "Couldn't find your husband, so left him a warning with his friend. That's what happens when people double-cross Jed Felton." "I don't understand." "You, lady," Jed whipped around to Grace. "You can put that frying pan down." He moved over to Grace and grabbed her roughly by her arm and pushed her down into a chair. "Why don't we talk about this like civilized human beings?" "'Cause," Jed snarled. "In case you haven't realized it yet, I ain't civilized." Lucky came lolloping into the cabin and sniffed the newcomer. Apparently unimpressed by the scent, he flopped down at Grace's feet. "I told the boys keeping you was useless. You're the worst guard dog I've ever known." Her words belied her actions as she threw leftover bacon to the enormous dog. He reached out his long tongue, snaffled the bacon, and grunted his satisfaction. "Now," Jed announced, "y'all sit on that side of the table so I can see you properly." George and Grace moved their chairs next to Hannah. George stooped to pick up her daughter. "It's all right, sweetheart." "Shut the kid up," Jed snapped. George patted Beth's back and whispered soothing words to her. Hannah couldn't believe this was really happening. Surely there had to be some mistake. This was not the type of man she could imagine Luke spending any time with, let alone owing him anything. "Maybe we could talk about it." "Time is over for talkin'." Jed turned away from Hannah to pierce George with a stare. "Suppose you like that baby of yours." George's lip trembled, but she didn't look away from Jed. "She is everything to me." "Good. You won't want to worry about anything bad happening to her, will ya?" "Woo. What do you mean?" "Give the baby to the old woman." George did as she was told and stood in front of Jed. Hannah could see her friend's hands shaking. "What do you need me to do?" "You fetch her husband," Jed pointed at Hannah. "Bring him back here. You try to pull any tricks and your baby dies." Grace gasped and held Beth closer to her body. Hannah folded her hands under her baby bump and breathed in deeply through her nose. It was going to be okay. George would bring Luke back to the cabin, and Jed's mistake would be cleared up. Anything else would be a disaster, and Hannah didn't think she could ever trust Luke again if it turned out he had brought danger to their little community. "I don't know which of the two of you is more distracted today," Eli complained. "It appears that my brother is in love," Josh said, jerking his head toward Noah, who was staring off across the Kansas prairie. "Do we get to see a picture of your sweetheart?" Eli shook his head and chuckled, as Noah didn't even hear his brother's question. "And that one is just as bad." "I heard that," Luke said. "I'm thinking. Maybe you could do that later and help us work for now?" "There's something wrong," Luke said, unable to stop himself from speaking what was on his mind. "What do you mean?" The joking tone had gone from Eli's voice. "Why do you think there's something wrong?" "I don't know," Luke admitted. "Maybe I'm being foolish." "That's not like you," Eli said. "Something happened in Council Grove." Luke lifted his hat from his head and wiped his brow with the back of his hand. "I've been trying to ignore it, but I can't stop thinking about it." "What happened?" "The man that killed Silas." Luke swallowed. "He was standing outside the church when Hannah and I left." "Did he speak to you?" That's just it, Luke said. He just stared at me. Are you sure it was him? The sun was in my eyes, but yes, I'm certain it was Jed Felton. Josh took off his own hat and twirled it in his fingers. Why did this Jed fella kill Silas? He'd started the story. He couldn't stop now. Jed thought I'd cheated at cards. He wanted his money back. You're a gambling man? Eli asked in disbelief. The familiar shame threatened to overwhelm Luke. I was. That hasn't been who I am for some years now. If Jed thought you'd cheated at cards, why did he kill your friend? Luke's throat closed as he remembered finding his friend propped up against the door of the room they shared when he returned to the saloon. At first, Luke had thought his friend was drinking off the whiskey they shared the night before, but the red stain across the front of his shirt told a story of its own. Bile rose from the pit of Luke's stomach at the memory of Silas's cold and lifeless body. He couldn't find me. He left a playing card on top of Silas's body so I would know it was him. Then he skipped town before the law could catch up with him. Luke wanted to lie down in the middle of the field and bawl like a baby. These were his friends, men that respected him. Would they ever look at him the same way again? Say, Noah called. Is that George? Luke swung around to see George running through the fields toward them. Something had happened to Hannah. Luke took off running toward the young woman who stumbled over the uneven earth as she hurried in their direction. What is it? What's wrong with Hannah? George bent at the middle as they reached each other. Nothing is wrong with Hannah, but you need to come back to the house straight away. George? Eli grabbed his wife's shoulders. What is it? A man, George panted. In the house. He said if I tell you he's here and any of you approach the house, he'll kill Beth. We'll see about that, Eli raged. Josh and Noah caught hold of the baby's father. We need to think about this. He's got to know you will tell us something is wrong. Luke fought to keep control of himself. He already knew Jed Felton to be a ruthless man, and he was holding 2 women and a baby as hostages. He had to know he'd be outnumbered in Walton Valley. What was his endgame? Luke's right, Josh said. He must have a plan to escape here with what he wants. He wants me. Luke dropped his head. Jed wants his money back foremost, and then he'll kill me. We won't let that happen, Noah stated. Didn't you hear what I said? Luke asked miserably. I gambled in saloons. My friend was killed because of me. You are all good men. I can't let you get mixed up with a man like Jed. We're already mixed up with him, Eli said fiercely. That man has my mother and my child. If I go with him, I'm sure he won't harm anyone else. That didn't work out so well for Silas, did it? Eli shot back. Okay. Josh held up a hand. Let's all calm down and think for a moment. I'll do whatever you need me to do. Noah stepped toward Luke. Did you cheat? No. Luke shook his head emphatically. I gambled, but I didn't cheat. I won the money fairly. That's good enough for me. Noah clapped Luke on the back. We'll help you sort this out. I appreciate your friendship, Noah, but I think for everyone else's safety, I should go back to Grace's house alone. I have to go with Luke, George said frantically. Otherwise, Eli pulled his wife into a swift embrace. Go, my darling. We will think of a way to save you all. I'm so sorry, Luke told him. Not as sorry as you will be if that outlaw hurts my family. Luke had felt shame before, but never like this. He was born in shameful circumstances, and his life had improved little in the 22 years that followed, until the night Silas died. How could he hold his head up in Walton Valley now his friends knew the type of man he had been? Chapter 11. Hannah's first thought when she saw her beleaguered husband was that she wanted to run to him and comfort him. Fear of Jed held her back, as did the knowledge that Luke was not the man she believed him to be. Hannah, is everything all right? George said I had to come back immediately. Jed moved behind Luke, produced a gun from the belt around his waist, and used the butt to deliver a resounding blow to the side of Luke's head. Luke staggered, then fell to his knees, blood dripping down his face. Hannah pushed herself to her feet. Sit down, Jed roared. I didn't say you could move. He's hurt. Hannah retook her seat. Have mercy. You gonna tell her, or shall I? He doesn't have a merciful bone in his worthless body, Luke muttered. Jed aimed a vicious kick to Luke's side. Hannah closed her eyes, hating to see Luke being brutalized by this man. Please, no one needs to get hurt further. What do you want from us? Johnson, Jed poked Luke with the toe of his boot. Revenge, Luke managed between gasps. He wants revenge. But he said he killed Silas, she said. Wasn't that revenge enough for whatever it is he says you've done? Luke looked up at her with pain-filled eyes. The word enough means nothing to a man like Jed Felton. He pushed himself up into a kneeling position, one arm held across his chest where Jed had kicked him. The wound on his head continued to bleed. Droplets fell off his chin onto his shirt, spreading out with alarming speed. Oh, I forgot I was talking to a preacher now. Jed barked out a laugh. How can you be a man of God? Luke shook his head. Please, no. What's that? Jed goaded. You don't want your nicely spoken wife to know where you came from? He looked at Hannah and closed his eyes. Luke, your husband is the child of a woman who sells herself in saloons. He don't even know who his pa is. Luke, she repeated. Yes, he whispered. He opened his eyes but did not look at her. It's true. Why does this matter? It doesn't change who Luke is now. We know him, and we love the man that he has become. Grace smiled softly in Luke's direction. Jed turned angry eyes on the older woman. You really want your grandchild to be brought up around a man who claims to be religious, but was the child of a lowly woman. A man who didn't even wait until he was married before he enjoyed his wife. You take that back, Luke cried. Say what you want about me. Do what you want to me, but don't speak that way about my wife. Hannah kept her voice deliberately low and calm. What do you want? I presume you arrived here on the wagon train. How do you plan to leave? I'll be leaving here with him. Jed aimed another kick at Luke, but he moved out of the way. You must have a wagon or something we can use. And then what? Jed laughed. I'll kill him, of course. We have money, Grace said. You can take all of our money. That is what you wanted from Luke, isn't it? Thanks, Jed nodded derisively. I'll take your money and I'll take him. You won't get away with it, George exclaimed with gusto. Hannah glanced at Luke, who steadfastly looked in the opposite direction. She hated that he hadn't trusted her enough to tell her the truth about his past, but his refusal to look her way hurt more. Who's gonna stop me, Missy? You? Jed turned to George. Luke, why did this man kill Silas? Why does he hate you so much? He stared off into the corner of the room. I was a gambler, Hannah. I lived in saloons all my life, learned the game from a young age. When he killed Silas, I was outside the saloon dead drunk. Learned how to cheat, Jed contradicted. I never cheated in my life, Luke hissed. That's a lie. Your friend had a card tucked up his sleeve. Fell out when he was begging for his life. He must have done that for you because he was the worst card player I've ever seen. You were the one who won the table that night. Luke shook his head. No, Silas wouldn't do that. I'm telling you that's what happened. You're not just a cheat but a liar too. Not surprising when you consider where you came from, is it? Hannah wanted to put her hands over her ears so she couldn't hear anymore. Please stop, Jed cackled. Don't suppose you love your husband much now you know the truth, do ya? She wanted to say that none of this mattered, but it did matter, not because of his birth. Not even because he had gambled in saloons and drank liquor, but because he hadn't trusted her enough to tell her the truth himself. She can't hate me any more than I hate myself. All very touching, Jed scoffed, but it's time we got out of here before anyone turns up thinking they can play the hero. Luke got to his feet. Let's go. You think I'm stupid? Jed asked. The minute we ride out of here, I'll get a bullet in my back. We wouldn't, George began. You would, Jed screamed. Now get your kid and give it to her. Jed pointed at Hannah. George transferred a sleeping Beth from Grace's arms to Hannah's. She kissed her baby's cheek, and then Hannah's. What? Hannah asked as her friends looked at her with deep sadness in their eyes. Your wife is a bit slow. He's bringing you with me. Luke finally looked at Hannah, and as his eyes met hers, the crack in her heart deepened. His blue eyes that she loved so much were dead. She may as well be a stranger. Me? You and the baby are my ticket out of here, Jed said slowly, as if she were stupid. No one is going to shoot at me when you're sitting right next to me holding the baby. He shoved Luke toward the door and then grabbed Hannah's hair roughly. He held the gun against her head. No one tries anything stupid. Grandma, get you money and anything else you have I can sell. Grace returned quickly with a pouch and handed it over to Jed. I will pray for your soul. Don't bother, he spat. I ain't got one. Terror made Hannah's legs tremble, but her steps did not falter. She had baby Beth to take care of, as well as her own unborn children. Now was not the time to fall apart. There was time enough for that when she had figured out a way out of this situation. She hadn't survived everything so far in her life for a rogue like Jed Felton to end it. When Luke did not touch her fingers with his or give her any other sign of reassurance, she knew she was on her own. The disappointment in her eyes tortured him. It was worse than the pain in his ribs and head combined. He ached to reach out to her, but the only way he could think to keep her safe was to convince Jed that he didn't care about her. Right, Mama. You walk over to their house with us. We'll stand right outside while you go in and get their valuables. Jed yanked at Hannah's head. Don't forget she's got you, kid, and I've got my gun. Luke walked over to Eliza's home. Every step felt like 100, as though he were walking both himself and Hannah to their deaths, which, of course, he probably was. Jed might not shoot them here. It might not be a mile away from Walton Valley, but he'd kill them all. Of that, he had no doubt. George hurried inside. Jed forced Luke to his knees, facing him so he could see the tight hold the outlaw had on Hannah. The only blessing was that Beth slept on, oblivious to the drama unfolding around her. Hurry up in there, Jed called. Hannah and Eliza have a lot of nice things, George shouted back. It's taking me a while to gather them all. The sisters had escaped their uncle with only small tokens to remind them of their dead parents. What was George doing? Luke heard the shuffling gait of Harry before the older man came into view behind Jed. The outlaw swung around. Who are you then? Harry asked conversationally. The man who's going to kill you if you don't go back to where you came from. Jed poked the gun hard against Hannah's temple. Or I can just shoot her right now. Harry shrugged. Shoot her if you like. She's nothing to me. Jed laughed. You hear that, Luke? He wants me to shoot your wife. Luke worked hard to keep all traces of emotion out of his voice. He didn't know what was happening, but it was no coincidence that George was still inside the cabin and Harry had turned up. If you were going to shoot her, you'd have done it by now. He didn't believe that, but he knew it was important that he keep Jed talking until George came back. Jed peered into the cabin. Where is that woman? Right behind you, George said steadily from her position at the corner of the house, the rifle she was holding in her hands pointing at the middle of Jed's chest. Are you stupid? Women can't shoot. Jed let out a string of curse words before George pulled the trigger. Jed flew backward with the impact of the shot, pulling Hannah and Beth with him. Hannah landed hard on her back, her arms cradling the baby close. Luke rushed to her side. Harry nodded in admiration. Excellent shot, my girl. People ran from all directions as Luke helped Hannah to her feet. Are you all right? Please tell me you're not hurt. George clutched Beth to her chest, tears pouring down her face. Eli wrapped his arms around his wife and daughter. Hannah stared at Luke as though she didn't recognize him. Josh knelt next to Jed. He's dead. Hannah? Luke touched her arm. Let's go sit inside. I'm not going anywhere with you. Yes, he mumbled. Of course. He looked around helplessly. Harry shrugged. You should have just told us. No one thinks any the less of you for your past. The words were unsaid, but Luke heard them anyway. They might not judge him for what happened before, but they would certainly judge him for what happened today. George, you and Hannah go to my mother's cabin. Eli took charge. Luke, go inside and I'll examine you. Noah, can you grab my medical bag, please? I don't need Dot. You're bleeding, Eli pointed out with none of his usual patience. He turned to look dispassionately at Jed's body. What should we do with him? I'll take him into Council Grove. Let the sheriff know what happened. I'll come with you, Harry said. Admit to the sheriff how I shot the lowlife. But you. Shot him, Harry repeated. You can tell the sheriff it was George if you want, but he won't believe you. Luke nodded. The movement made his head ache. His ears were ringing and his legs trembled. His chest felt as though it was on fire. He looked at Hannah's retreating back and knew what he had to do. He would take Jed's body to the sheriff, but he wouldn't come back. No one here would miss him. Not after he'd almost got them all killed. It didn't matter how far he'd run away from his past. It had just caught up with him. Hannah, Grace, and George gathered in Grace's cabin. Grace looked at the floor and shook her head in disgust. Grabbing the bucket of water Noah had carried up earlier, she went outside and stoked the fire. After she added more fuel to it, she poured the water into the pot, then swung it over the fire. Eli will need hot water to clean Luke's wounds. I need to scrub the floor. Grace twisted her hands together as she walked back into her home. George put an arm around her mother-in-law's shoulders and gently pressed her into a chair. What you need is to sit down. You're in shock. And you're not. Grace raised her eyebrows. You just shot a man dead. She saved us all, Hannah retorted, still somewhat in awe of George and more than a little scared. How did you appear behind Jed? Climbed out the window, George admitted. Harry was in the barn with his gun, so he went to Eliza's house thinking Jed would stop there on his escape. Josh was outside his cabin, Eli ours, and Noah outside Harry's. When I went into the bedroom, Harry explained this to me and passed me the gun. Then he distracted Jed long enough to give me time to creep up behind him. They were well prepared. Eli made a good plan, George confirmed. He would not let Jed leave Walton Valley with Beth. How are you feeling, Hannah? Grace asked. You took a heavy tumble. The bottom of her back jarred as she hit the hard ground, but she didn't think there would be any lasting repercussions. I think I'll be sore in the morning, but thank God, I'm all right. And the revelations about Luke, how do you feel about those? He lied to me. Hannah's eyes burned with the effort of holding back tears. From the day we met, he's pretended to be someone he isn't. Has he? Grace questioned. He is who he is now. That man is different to the one he once was. I don't think he's pretended to be a better man. I think he is that man now. I asked him about Jed, Hannah continued. Of course, I didn't know what his name was then, but I asked Luke who he was, and he pretended not to know him. I asked him about his parents, and he told me the bare minimum. I trusted him. Why did I do that? Because you love him, Grace answered. Yes, Hannah admitted miserably. I do. Can you forgive him? Hannah turned to George. Can you forgive him? Jed used your child as a shield. Jed did. I don't blame Luke for what happened. He couldn't have known Jed would follow him to Walton Valley. He should have. Hannah stopped because what exactly did she think he could have done to stop what happened today? He should have warned us we might be in danger. Maybe, George said. But what would we have all done differently? Started carrying guns as we walked down to the creek. Hidden them in our sewing baskets. Hindsight is a wonderful thing. I don't know if I can forgive him, she admitted. Grace reached over and patted her hand. It may take you some time. Now, I will make a pot of herbal tea. While it's steeping, I'll scrub this floor clean. Then it'll be time to make lunch. The fortitude of both women amazed Hannah. Although she could see Grace's hands shaking, the older woman was determined to get on with her usual chores. We can choose to focus on what happened, or we can count our blessings and move on with our lives. George lifted the baby to her shoulder and rubbed her back. Trials in life rarely end up being about the actual event, but how we respond to them. She wasn't sure she had enough strength left to cope with another ordeal. She'd left behind everything in England, suffered through losing her parents, her uncle's abuse, and now this. Where is God in all of this? Where he always is, Grace said quietly. He is at your side. He will comfort you if you allow him to. Hannah remembered praying when she was on the floor in the abandoned hut during the tornado. It might not have been his comforting arms around her, but had he sent Luke to do that for him? That was the first time in many months that Hannah could remember feeling that God heard her prayers. Since then, she had started to believe he had a place in her life. Now she was struggling to believe in anything. She trusted Luke, and he'd let her down. How could a man like that make a decent and dependable father to her babies? Eli came into the cabin. "Thank you for putting the water on to boil, Mama. I'll need it to clean Luke's wound." Then he's determined to set straight off to Council Grove with the body. "Hannah, would you like to see him?" Her heart fluttered with hope. "Is he asking for me?" "Well," Eli stuttered awkwardly. "No, but I'm sure he would like you to visit before he leaves." Hannah looked away. She'd reached the limit of what she could bear for this day. "I don't believe I wish to see him." She lifted her chin and looked at her friends in turn. Their eyes looked upon her sadly, but no one spoke up in defense of Luke. What could they say? He didn't even want to see her after what happened. That said everything about his character she wanted to know. Hannah stayed inside the cabin as the squeak of the old cart's wheels announced Luke's departure. She would weaken if she saw him, and throw herself into his arms, grateful in the knowledge that he hadn't been more seriously injured by Jed. She allowed the tears she'd held in to fall. Putting her head onto the table, Hannah sobbed out her frustrations. Just when her life had seemed so settled, and she'd believed Luke loved her despite her past, he had shown her he simply didn't love her enough. Chapter 12. "I'm disappointed in you, son." "Harry, we've barely left Walton Valley," Luke pointed out. "I knew the lecture would come, but I thought I had a bit of time yet." Harry shrugged. "You deserve it." Luke sighed. "They might as well get it over with. Which part of this whole sorry mess are you most disappointed in?" "You didn't even fight for her. Jed had a gun." "I don't mean then, I'm talking about when he was gone and we were leaving." Luke could feel Harry staring at him, but he kept his gaze forward. "How could you depart and not even speak to that poor girl?" "You heard Eli. She didn't want to see me." "She'd just been terrified half out of her wits," Harry snapped. "I was wrong. I'm not just disappointed in you. I'm disgusted." "She's better off without me," Luke said morosely. "How do you work that out?" Harry shouted, his temper erupting. "You married the girl. Now she's not just pregnant, but she's alone." "She'll never be alone in Walton Valley." "It's not everyone else's responsibility to take care of her. It's yours. You're her husband." Why couldn't Harry see? He was leaving Walton Valley and never coming back because he loved her. "She deserves better than me." Harry sighed. "We spoke about this before. Do you remember my answer?" "You told me I was right. I wasn't good enough for her." "I also told you to work on yourself. Make yourself worthy of her. Thought you was doing that." "I tried." "You married," Harry practically screeched, as though Luke was in a different county or hard of hearing. "That means you try harder, you don't give up. Even if that's what is best for Hannah." "I think that bang to the head has addled what's left of your brains." Harry slapped his leg in frustration. "Can't you see the girl loves ya? Despite the fact you're a bone-headed, simple-minded fool." "But—" Yeah, Harry interrupted. "You've said you're not good enough for her. You're doing all of this for her, blah blah. Oh, and I missed one insult. You're self-centered too." Luke tried to make sense of Harry's words. Was it possible he had got this all wrong? He thought he was doing a selfless thing to leave Hannah to get on with her life, without a man like him. "You heard the type of woman my mother was?" Luke asked cautiously, testing out his theory. "Hannah doesn't care about that, and neither does anyone else." "I gambled and drank hard liquor in saloons." "You still do that?" "Of course not," Luke said. "I changed after Silas died." "Next excuse?" Luke held the reins in one hand and swiped the other across his face. "I was working on courting Hannah properly. Everything was going so well." "That's 'cause you were doing what I told you to." "Do you really think she loves me?" Luke held his breath while he waited for Harry's answer. "Probably not after the way you've just run out on her like a big coward." Harry spread his hands out wide in front of him. "You've messed this up good and proper, my boy." "I don't know how to fix it." "Wanting to put things right is the first step," Harry encouraged. "Right now, you could crawl back to Walton Valley on your hands and knees. though I don't think that would be enough to prove how sorry you are to Hannah's satisfaction. Something that had been rattling around in the back of his head now occurred to Luke. You never did really explain how my horse appeared back at the livery just as we were ready to leave Council Grove. Didn't I? Harry scratched his head. If I remember right, I went to borrow a horse, and they had found yours. What fortunate timing, Luke said sarcastically. If I didn't know better, I'd think you engineered the whole thing, so Hannah and I had to marry. Harry looked out across the prairie. You seem to have mixed me up with a meddlesome matchmaker. I think that's exactly what you are, Luke said. Now what are you going to do to help me? Help you? Harry squeaked. I think I've done enough of that. You can sort out your own mess. I need you, Luke wheedled. I've not done very well by myself, have I? That's true. Luke played his trump card. You don't want Hannah to be miserable without me, do you? Oh, Harry wailed. That's a low blow. What is it you need me to do? Hannah did her best to carry on as normal after Luke left, but instead of it getting easier as the days went by, it got harder. She missed him in ways she hadn't even considered. Luke helped her get up and ready every morning, as the weight of the twins made it increasingly more difficult for her. He told her she was beautiful each day before he left for work, and when he returned, he made her feel as though she was the only thing that had been on his mind all day. In short, his love and care for her had encouraged her to start believing that she was worthy of the love he was showing her. She sighed, and Grace put down her sewing. Enough. Are you going to live the rest of your days pining for the man, or are you going to do something about it? Hannah blinked at Grace's stern tone. He's left. He's gone to Council Grove, Grace said in a gentler voice. He hasn't set off on a ship to a foreign land. The question is, are you going to let him get away with that? Hannah looked at George, who lifted one shoulder, a wry grin on her face. Pointless looking at me to help you out. It's completely acceptable to wallow a little when your heart is broken. It's what you do after that which is important. But he's not here, she repeated. Which gives you two options, Grace said. Option 1 is you stay put here and wait for Harry to work his magic on Luke. Or you can go after him. I couldn't do that, Hannah protested. A lady shouldn't chase after a man. No matter how dreamy his eyes. George waggled her eyebrows, and Hannah couldn't help but laugh at her friend. I'm not going all the way to Council Grove because Luke has pretty eyes. I agree, Grace poured more tea into their cups. I favor option 1. I have complete faith in Harry that he will deliver Luke back to us any day now. And if he doesn't? Hannah asked, trying to ignore the excitement building in her stomach at seeing Luke again. Then you chase him, George said firmly, lady or not. But Grace held up a hand. Ordinarily, I would never advocate such a thing, but in these circumstances, it would be the correct thing to do. Luke believes his mother and some man he has never met but who fathered him are the most important factors in what makes his character. You're a particularly well-brought-up young lady from England. That makes him even more ashamed of his past. And I'm not humiliated of my own. That's the precise problem, George joined in. Both of you believe your pasts are the most important factor. What happened to you was dreadful, but you shouldn't allow it to define your future. He let me down. He let us all down, Grace said firmly. Luke should have trusted us all enough to tell us about Jed, especially when he knew he was close by. However, it's obvious why he hid that from us. He didn't think we would respect him anymore if we knew what he'd done years ago. Exactly right. Grace picked up her sewing again. I understand his thinking, but he should know better than anyone else that Jesus died for our sins, so that we may repent of the things that bring us shame and be clean once more. That is available for every man, woman, and child who professes to follow him. For a preacher, his self-awareness is sadly lacking. Hannah laughed at Grace's choice of words, and for the first time since Jed had appeared in their lives, she had a little more hope for her future. They pulled into Council Grove and stopped outside the jail. Frank Norton met Luke at the door. His hands were folded across his expansive stomach, and he turned to spit a stream of tobacco into the dirt. Thought you got married? I surely did, Luke answered. Shouldn't you be home looking after your new wife and not here? We had a problem back in Walton Valley. Luke indicated the back of the cart, where Jed's body lay covered by an old quilt. The sheriff strode over and lifted the quilt, nodded quickly, then looked back to Luke. Whoever shot him has done me, and the rest of the town, a favor. He caused a lot of trouble when he was here. Couldn't pin anything on him, though. Don't you want to know why he was shot? Luke had been in some lawless towns, but even the worst of them would have wanted an explanation for a dead man with a bullet in his back. I suppose he deserved it? He terrorized the women of our community. He was going to take my grandbaby hostage, Harry added. So I killed him. Frank nodded again. Thanks, Harry. Is that it? Luke asked, incredulous at the sheriff's nonchalance. Last time I was in town, you threw me in jail for spending a night with an unmarried young woman, through absolutely no fault of our own. Now we bring a dead man to you, and you couldn't be less interested. Now, Luke, that's enough. Harry jabbed Luke in the ribs with his elbow. The breath left his body as fire spread through his chest. My ribs! Sorry about that, Harry said, sounding the opposite. That dead fella beat up the preacher, too. What's his name? Jed Felton. The sheriff stared at Luke, and, for a moment, he thought he was going to ask questions about how he knew Jed or why he ended up in Walton Valley. Okay, thanks. Harry pulled Luke away. It's finished. But, Luke shook his head. It doesn't seem right. A man is dead. Do you believe he would have kept Hannah and baby Beth alive when he had finished using them as human shields? No, I guess not. The answer came quickly, because he knew Jed would have killed them both. We don't want the sheriff or anyone else asking questions. You want to keep your past private. And I don't want anyone looking into that fella's death. My George saved the life of your wife, her unborn children, and her own child. She is a heroine, but we both know there are some who may not see things that way. Luke thought about Hannah and how he would feel if she had been injured, or worse, at the hands of Jed Felton. George had done the right thing protecting Hannah and 3 innocent children. I understand. Can I ask you something, preacher? If you must. Harry cackled at Luke's reluctant tone. How do you feel about those babies of Hannah's? I love them and want to raise them as my own children. Harry eyed Luke slyly. Do you really? Harry, we've had a long day. I don't really want an argument with you, but we can have one if you carry on these ridiculous questions. You love them, even though you know about their pa? I will be their father. Luke slapped a hand across his chest, then winced at the pain from his ribs. But won't the twins be stained? Stop! Luke lifted his hands to grab the lapels of Harry's shirt and shake some sense into him, then dropped them to his side. What was the matter with his friend? Had he had too much sun? Those children are innocent. I won't have... Cool down, Luke. Harry looked pointedly at Luke's clenched fists. I've made my point, so you can stop looking like you want to kill me. Luke's head swam. What point were you making? The twins are not responsible for how they came into this world. They are innocent children and bear no stain for their pa's actions. We've established that, Luke said impatiently. No one has ever sought to say otherwise. Harry turned to Luke. So how is it you hold yourself responsible for your birth? That's different. Is it? How? Hannah didn't choose what happened to her, but my mother chose the way she lived her life. I would argue that she probably didn't. Harry looked off toward the east end of town. I wager if we were to visit one of those saloons, there wouldn't be a single woman in the place who would tell us they chose that way to live their lives. My mother never tried to do anything else. Even as he spoke, Luke recognized the futility in his words. It wouldn't have mattered if his mother tried to get away from the saloon in which she worked. She had nowhere to go and no other way to make money. Maybe she earned money to raise you in the only way she knew how. Harry laid a hand on Luke's arm. Seems to me she did a pretty good job of raising you cause. When you're not being mule-headed, you're a good man. Was he a good man? He'd been trying to be. Silas's unnecessary death had shown him what could happen to him if he didn't change his ways. Since that night, he hadn't been near a saloon, hadn't played a game of cards, nor drunk even so much as a drop of liquor. Then he dedicated himself to the Lord and started praying in earnest for help in overcoming his past. "Thank you, Harry," Luke replied. "When you're not being an annoying know-it-all and an interfering matchmaker, you're actually a pretty decent fellow, too." Chapter 13. Hannah finished sewing the last of the nightgowns for her babies and placed it into a basket with the rest of their clothes. "Your work is beautiful," George commented. "I enjoy sewing," Hannah told her. "It helps me to relax." "You should sell them in the store," George suggested, "when the boys finally build it. We could do with a few more men here in Walton Valley to finish all the building projects our little community needs," Grace mused. "A store, perhaps a church, eventually a school." George smiled indulgently at her mother-in-law. "It'll be years before Beth and Hannah's children are ready for a school." Grace returned George's smile. "That is true, my dear, but imagine if we could plan and build what we need in advance. That would attract more settlers." "I'm not sure I want a lot of strangers living here with us," Hannah remarked. "I like things as they are." "You must think of the future," Grace cautioned. "When your babies are old enough, do you want them to go live in another town because there isn't enough here in Walton Valley for them? I have a hard enough time imagining a time when they are here, let alone thinking about what their life will be like when they are adults. Just think about it." Grace leaned over and looked at Beth, who slept soundly in a basket next to George's feet. "I remember when Eli and Isaac were that age. Now Eli has a child of his own, and Isaac." Grace's voice tailed off, and Hannah's heart broke for her friend. Grace rarely spoke of her eldest son, but when she did, her emotions quickly overtook her. "Would you like to tell us about Isaac?" Grace patted her eyes with a handkerchief. "I believe I would." "Was he like Eli?" Grace laughed. "Oh goodness, no. Even as children, my boys couldn't have been more dissimilar. Eli was always a sensible, quiet child, eager to follow instructions and very biddable. Isaac was a touch wild. Despite my efforts and that of his nanny, Isaac got into scrape after scrape." "How long has it been since you last saw him?" Grace paused for so long, Hannah didn't think she was going to answer, and she wished she hadn't asked the question. 7 years, and not a single day has passed that I haven't prayed for his safety and for him to be returned to his family." "Eli said you never received word from him after he left," George said gently. "Nothing," Grace confirmed. "I know Eli thinks his brother is dead, but as his mother, I believe I would know if that were true. I feel Isaac is alive. I don't know what could have caused him to leave us, and Amelia, who he adored." "Amelia was his fiancée?" "Yes, and Eli's fiancée after Isaac's disappearance." Grace paused to look at George, though of course Eli only agreed to that to appease his father. Charles could be a very persuasive man. "I'm still hopelessly jealous of Amelia." George grinned. "Why? Anybody with 2 eyes in their head can see that Eli is completely besotted by you." "Oh, I know," George frowned at her sewing project. "But Amelia is good at all the things I'm not. For instance, Grace tells me she is an excellent seamstress." "But is she able to protect her family and friends against an outlaw?" Hannah raised an eyebrow. George grimaced. "I hate that such action was necessary. He would certainly have killed me and Beth." Hannah shuddered at the memory of Jed's gun pressed against her temple. In the immediate aftermath, she was furious with Luke. The last thing she wanted was to speak to him. Now she wished she had, if only to let him know how disappointed she was with him. "I guess that's why I suggested you should chase after Luke if Harry doesn't bring him back. There are several things I wish I had done differently with Isaac. Things I wish I had said. Choices I would dearly love to have over again. Maybe then I would have both of my sons with me." Hannah's stomach pitched with nerves, as it did every time she thought of her errant husband. She had practiced what she would say to him as different scenarios played out in her head. Never had she contemplated that she wouldn't have the chance to speak to him again. What if he decided he didn't want to come back to Walton Valley, or thought she hated him so much after what happened with Jed that he never came back? "I'm still furious with him, but I miss Luke so much." It felt better to admit her feelings to her friends, even though it didn't change the situation. Of course you do, Grace said sympathetically. How much longer are you going to give him before you take action? Tomorrow, Hannah said decisively. If he isn't back by then, I'll ask the boys to get our old wagon out and hitch up the oxen. George laughed. I love your enthusiasm, Hannah, but you can't drive a team of oxen. I can if I have to, she said stubbornly. You should plan on company, George told her. If you need to go to Council Grove to retrieve that stubborn husband of yours, plan on taking me and Beth with you. Tears of gratitude pricked Hannah's eyes. I couldn't ask that of you. You didn't, I offered. That's what friends do for each other. Hannah held out her hands. Then you had better pass me that shirt of Eli's you're darning because, as you've pointed out, your talents do not lie in needlework. With a smile of gratitude, George handed over the shirt and bent to pick up Beth, who had begun to fuss. Hannah missed her sister, but she was so grateful to have Grace and George to keep her company. When she was traveling on the wagon train west with Thomas and Eliza, she had been lost in her own misery. Arriving in Walton Valley had been the start of her life improving drastically. Was it possible that God had the perfect plan for her future before she had even known what she needed herself? Luke left Council Grove with Harry as soon as the sun peeped over the horizon. Eager to get home and put right the damage he had caused in his relationship with Hannah, he was prepared to do whatever it took to earn her forgiveness. The hours passed interminably until, finally, he could see smoke from the campfire outside of Grace's cabin snaking upwards. We're nearly home, he said excitedly to Harry. I see that, Harry replied nonchalantly. You know what you're going to say to her? Luke's stomach pitched with nerves. What if Hannah was so upset with him she refused to even hear him out? He drew his shoulders back. If he needed to, he would apologize to her every day for the rest of his life. As he drew his horse up near the campfire, Hannah came to the door of Grace's cabin. She held a hand up to shield her eyes from the sun. Luke reminded himself to breathe as the sight of her stole away his breath. He'd missed her, but he hadn't realized how much until he saw her again. He threw the reins to Harry and jumped down from the cart. Hannah. She looked at him warily, but didn't walk away. His heart lifted. Luke. Great. They remembered each other's names. It wasn't the most auspicious start. Luke fought to remember the speech he planned out in his head the night before when he was so excited at the thought of coming home he hadn't been able to sleep. I've missed you so much, he said desperately, and although his words were true, he hadn't planned them at this stage of his grand speech. She stared back at him, but she didn't respond. His heart hammered painfully against his injured ribs. Would you take a walk with me? I'm busy helping Grace with lunch. I don't have time. Grace appeared behind Hannah and gave her a little shove forward. You are excused. Still, she made no move of her own toward him. He would give anything for the feel of her small hand in his, the touch of her lips against his, and the ability to hold her in his arms and wake up every morning to her beautiful face. I'm sorry I got everything so wrong. The pain in her eyes lanced his heart, and he hated himself for causing her such hurt. I should have trusted you with truth about myself, but I was so embarrassed. I couldn't bear for you to look at me like you did when we first met. Like I didn't trust you. He deserved that. I think I've loved you from the first moment I saw you. However, I always knew I wasn't nearly good enough for you. I never wanted you to look at me the way I see myself. And yet you did the one thing that meant I would instantly lose respect for you. Hannah moved forward a step. You didn't trust me with the truth. Not you, he said, wanting nothing more to gather her in his arms. It was never you I didn't trust. I was so scared that if you knew the truth, you wouldn't want to stay married to me. That amounts to the same thing. She looked away from him. A slight breeze blew a strand of blonde hair across her cheek. He wanted to reach out and tuck it behind her ear. How could you love a man like me, he pleaded. A man born to a mother whose occupation meant she couldn't tell me who my pa is. A man who was so intoxicated that he passed out behind a saloon while his best friend was being murdered. I did, she whispered. I did love that man. Did. Could you love him again? Tell me about Silas. What do you want to know? I'll tell you anything you want to know. Everything. Tell me how you met. She took a step closer, and it was all Luke could do to maintain the distance between them and hope his words brought her closer. Silas was a couple of years younger than me. His parents were married, and he lived in a proper house. I wanted his life. Right until his mother died, and his father remarried. After that, Silas was as miserable at home as I was, so we left. Where did you go? Luke barked out a mirthless laugh. Where didn't we go? Silas wanted to find somewhere to settle down and rebuild his life. He wanted to recreate the happy family home he had when his mother was alive. And you didn't? He struggled to find the right words. It wasn't that I didn't want to, but after my childhood, the freedom of traveling from one town to another was intoxicating. You made money by gambling? She glanced at him sharply. Is that how you could afford to stake your claim? Is our home being built on land you bought from the proceeds of gambling? He wanted to tell her he had some sort of gainful employment, and that is where the money had come from, but she had asked for the truth. Yes, I see. I was raised in a brothel, Hannah, and had little schooling. I didn't have the opportunity of learning any skills other than playing cards. I realize that differs greatly from what you're used to, but that was my life. That isn't something I can change. Do you miss that way of life? No, he told her. I don't miss any part of it. Not the gambling, the drinking, or the traveling. Admittedly, it was Silas who wanted to settle down in one place. I agreed to appease him, but I always promised him one more town, one more card game. Then we would have enough money to buy land. You broke your promise to Silas. Shame filled Luke. Yes, over and over again. Is it possible what Jed said about Silas was true? That he hid a playing card up his sleeve? It could have happened, but Silas wasn't that type of man. He was a good man. Even good men do bad things when they feel like they have no choice, she said. Could Silas have been so desperate to stop moving around that he cheated so you'd win? He had no reason to believe anything a criminal like Jed Felton had to say, yet Hannah's assumption had the ring of truth about it. As we were riding into town, I said one big win and we'd have enough money to buy our own land. What's different about then and now, she asked. Why did you choose to settle in Walton Valley when you'd been traveling around gambling and then preaching? You, he told her with no hesitation. I met you. You didn't even know me. No, he admitted. I didn't, but I wanted to. You made me want to fulfill all the plans Silas and I made. You ran away when I needed you most. Her words were simple, but were more powerful for their simplicity. I thought I was doing what was best for you. Can you ever forgive me? What for? She moved closer. If he reached out a hand, he could touch her, and Lord knew he needed to. For not trusting you with the truth about myself, for leaving when you needed me, but most of all for being too afraid to be the man you needed me to be. Can you be that man now? Yes. Luke couldn't wait a moment longer. He picked up one of her hands and pressed a kiss to her palm. With God's help, I will be that man for the rest of our lives. You let me love you, Luke. Tears wobbled on her eyelashes. You let me love you, then you let me down. He closed the remaining distance between them, and he pulled her into his arms. I'm so sorry, my dear sweet Hannah. He held her face in his hands and kissed her. She sighed and leaned her head against his chest. If you hadn't come home this morning, George was going to hitch her old wagon and drive us into Council Grove to bring you back. Luke laughed out loud. Really? Hannah pulled back and looked up at him. Really? I couldn't bear to be without you. Her earlier words suddenly came back to him. You let me love you. You said you loved me. I did. Might you be able to love me again? I never stopped. She reached up and caressed his face. I didn't like you very much when you left for Council Grove, but I didn't stop loving you. I've got something for you. He caught hold of her hand and led her over to the wagon. Sunflowers, she wrinkled her nose in confusion. You once told me the thing you missed most about England was the roses in your uncle's garden. I can't buy you roses, Hannah. but I bought these yellow flowers from a fellow in Council Grove. He assures me if I replant them, they will continue to grow. I thought we could put them in the soil near the creek. It'll be easy to keep them watered, and they will be the first thing you see when you look out of our bedroom window in a morning." "Isn't that the sweetest thing you ever heard?" Grace said, as she smiled at Luke approvingly. "He's rather good at apologizing," George agreed. "Don't forget what I told you, Hannah girl," Harry called. "If you get tired of the preacher, you can always marry me." "I'm already married," Hannah said in a mock stern voice. "And I'm very happy with my choice. At least I will be if my husband kisses me again." Luke was happy to oblige and lowered his head to kiss Hannah. With his wife in his arms, he had finally found his way home. Epilogue. 3 months later. "My valley is getting overrun by females," Harry groaned in mock disgust as he peered at the babies cradled in Hannah's arms. "That's no way to speak about my daughters," Luke grinned proudly. "Beth is excited to have friends to play with," George said. Beth smiled, as if on cue, showing off her new tooth. "She might have to wait a little while," Hannah said, "but I'm certain the 3 of them will be the very best of friends." "Do you have names for your girls?" Grace asked. "We do." Hannah smiled and indicated the twin nestled in the crook of her left arm. "This is Charlotte Eliza. And this." Luke reached out a hand and tenderly stroked the other twin's cheek with the back of his forefinger. "Is Scarlett Georgiana." "Oh!" George gasped. "You used my name." "It's only right that we did," Luke said. "Scarlett is my mother's name. Without her, and without you, George, I wouldn't be here right now." Hannah smiled proudly at her husband. His mother might not have been perfect, but she had given him life and raised a good man, even though he had been fighting against that for most of his years. By giving one of their daughters his mother's name, he was accepting his past instead of trying to run away from it. In the months following Luke's return to Walton Valley, the men of the community had finished the harvest and built Harry's store. They had also added on to Thomas and Eliza's home, so they had more room for Thomas's family when they arrived from Ireland. Finally, they had completed a home for Noah and his mail-order bride, who was expected to arrive in Council Grove before Christmas. If only Eliza and Thomas had returned from their trip, then her happiness would be complete. They had been delayed in independence following their uncle's trial. They had written to say he had received a long prison sentence. With Luke's help and lots of prayer, she had finally closed that chapter of her life. She was who she was today, despite what happened to her at her uncle's hands, and not because of it. "It's snowing," Noah called. "Close the door," Harry yelled. "Don't you know, new babies need to be kept warm." The sound of the door being pulled closed sounded in the small cabin, and Noah appeared at the doorway to the bedroom, his face flushed. "Sorry, I guess I still have a lot to learn before my new wife turns up." Josh grinned at his brother. "You've got plenty of time to learn about babies. At least 9 months, I'd say." Noah glanced at Hannah and her babies, and he gulped. "Maybe we'll wait a while before having children." "You adore babies," George said, as Beth reached out a chubby hand toward Noah. "And Beth certainly loves her Uncle Noah." "I'm content to be Uncle Noah to these 3 girls," he said. "I don't think I'm quite ready for my own children just yet." Hannah caught Luke's eye, and they smiled at each other. Sometimes life gives you exactly what you thought you didn't want. It had taken her some time to accept that it was because God's plan was perfect, as was his timing. The end.